Hey everyone, thanks for being here with me tonight. Tonight we have 12 separate stories to go through, which is a massive collection of the strange, dark, and mysterious. These cases come from all over the world, and they are all strange, dark, and very real. Some involve twisted crimes in small towns, while others are tragic accidents that spiral into nightmares in the blink of an eye. We are going to travel from the American Midwest to the deep waters of the North Sea, and finally to the humid, moss-draped estates of South Carolina. It is going to be a long journey, so I hope you are ready. Before we start, do me a favor. Take a look at the like button. I want you to sneak into its house while it is sleeping and secretly paint over its phone camera with clear, see-through nail polish. That way, when it wakes up and tries to use Face ID to unlock its phone, it will never work, and it will be locked out of its digital life forever. Also, please subscribe to the channel and turn on all notifications so you do not miss any of our weekly uploads. And in the comments, let me know where you are watching from and what time it is for you right now. Outside your window, rain has started to fall. At first, it is just a few light drops on the glass. Then it turns into a steady, soft curtain of sound. The world outside is gray and wet, and the rhythm of the water against the pane is the only thing you can hear. The camera pulls away from your room now, moving through the rainy night, drifting over miles of dark highways and wet pavement. It settles on a crowded asphalt parking lot in Mason, Ohio. It is a warm evening in May, and the air is filled with the distant, excited screams of teenagers and the mechanical roar of roller coasters. The year is 1983. John Harder was the kind of guy who seemed to have it all figured out. He was a senior at a high school in Delaware, Ohio, a small town just outside the state capital. By all accounts, John was the classic popular kid. He was athletic, good-looking, and charismatic. But unlike the stereotype of the high school jock who pushes people around, John was known for being genuinely kind. He was the type of person who would go out of his way to make you smile. He had a great sense of humor and was famous for pulling harmless pranks, like jumping into the cheerleading squad during a pep rally just to make the crowd laugh. John was just weeks away from graduating. The date was set for June 5th, 1983. He had plans for his future, too. He was going to attend Kent State University in the fall to study accounting. Everything was lined up for him. But before he could get to graduation in college, there was one big event on the calendar that everyone was looking forward to. It was called Grad Night. This was a special event held at Kings Island, a massive amusement park about 2 hours west of their high school. The park would shut down its normal operations and open exclusively for high school seniors with special tickets. John was 17 years old, and like most of his classmates, he was thrilled about the trip. He bought his ticket, and so did about 20 other students from his school. On Friday, May 13th, the group met up in the school parking lot around 3:30 in the afternoon. Since this was a school-sanctioned event, but not a school bus trip, the students were responsible for driving themselves. They piled into a few different cars and started the 2-hour drive toward the amusement park. It was the kind of road trip that feels like pure freedom when you are 17. However, the drive was not just about listening to music and talking about the future. John, who was a passenger in one of the cars, decided to start the party early. During the ride, he drank half a bottle of rum and somewhere between 3 to 6 beers. By the time they stopped for food and bathroom breaks, and finally arrived at the park gates around 7 in the evening, John was incredibly intoxicated. He could barely stand up straight as he walked toward the entrance. He managed to pull it together enough to show his ticket to the attendant, and he stumbled into the park with his friends. Even though Grad Night was a private event, Kings Island was packed. Thousands of seniors from schools all over the region had descended on the park. The atmosphere was chaotic and electric. Once inside, the students from John's high school naturally split up into smaller groups. There was no rule saying they had to stay together, so they drifted off to find the rides they wanted. John ended up in a group that included his girlfriend, Pam. But what should have been a fun night of rides and games quickly turned sour. For the first hour, John and Pam did nothing but fight. Onlookers who saw them that night said John looked visibly upset. He was emotional, likely fueled by the massive amount of alcohol he had consumed in the car. He and Pam bickered constantly as they walked through the crowds. By 8:30 in the evening, John's group was standing in line for a roller coaster, but John was done. He started openly complaining, telling everyone that he did not want to be there anymore. He kept saying he just wanted to go home. His friends tried to calm him down, telling him to relax and just enjoy the ride, promising they would get food afterward. But John was beyond reasoning. He was drunk, angry at his girlfriend, and miserable. Despite his complaints, he got on the roller coaster with his group around 9 o'clock. They rode the ride, screaming and twisting through the tracks. But as soon as it was over, John made his move. The group got off the ride and walked a short distance away to regroup and figure out what to do next. When they looked around to do a head count, they realized John was gone. He had slipped away the moment they stepped off the platform. His friends waited for a few minutes, scanning the crowd for him. They actually walked around the immediate area, checking near the exit of the ride, but he was nowhere to be found. They talked it over and decided that he probably just needed some space. He had been so agitated and vocal about wanting to leave that they assumed he had gone off to sulk or maybe to find a quiet place to sit down. They figured they would bump into him later in the night, or he would just meet them back at the cars when the park closed. So, they moved on without him. For the next few hours, John's friends rode other coasters and ate park food, gradually forgetting about the drama from earlier in the evening. They assumed John was fine. Around midnight, the loudspeakers crackled to life, announcing that the park was closing. The crowds began to filter toward the exits. John's group walked out to the parking lot, fully expecting to see John leaning against one of their cars, probably asleep or just waiting for them to unlock the doors. But when they got to the cars, John was not there. They waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Other groups from their high school arrived at the cars, but none of them had seen John either. The excitement of the night began to wear off, replaced by a creeping sense of worry. They stood by the cars, staring at the front gate, watching the stream of students dwindle down to nothing. Eventually, the park lights started to flick off, section by section, plunging the massive rides into darkness. A security guard appeared at the front entrance and locked the main gates. John was still missing. Based on an extensive investigation by the police later, authorities were able to piece together what John did after he vanished from his group. When he slipped away from the roller coaster around 9 o'clock, he did not go to the parking lot. Instead, he stumbled through the crowds toward the center of the park, drawn to its most famous landmark. Rising 300 feet into the air was a 1/3 scale replica of the Eiffel Tower. It was a massive steel structure that dominated the skyline, offering incredible views of the park from 2 observation decks. The tower had 3 elevators that ran up the central spine of the structure. These elevators whisked guests up to a 50-foot observation platform, and then higher to a platform at 275 feet. But there was another way up. In 1983, there was a staircase that ran up the middle of the tower, wrapping around the elevator shafts. The public was allowed to use these stairs, but only to get to the first platform at 50 feet. Beyond that, the stairs were strictly off limits. John, in his drunken haze, found the base of the tower. He did not get in line for the elevator. He found the stairs and began to climb. He trudged up the steps, the sounds of the park drifting up to him. He reached the 50-foot platform, the authorized limit for guests. Right there on the staircase, blocking the way up, was a 6-foot-tall fence with a gate. It was locked, and it carried a sign that read, "Authorized personnel only." It was a clear barrier, designed to keep people from going any higher into the dangerous machinery of the tower. John did not stop. He looked at the gate, then climbed right over it. He dropped down onto the stairs on the other side and kept walking upward. He was now trespassing in a restricted area, climbing higher and higher into the dark steel skeleton of the tower. He climbed until he was just below the 275-foot platform. He was nearly at the top. The wind would have been stronger up there, whistling through the thousands of metal beams that held the structure together. At this point, John stopped climbing. He turned away from the stairs and faced the hollow center of the tower. In front of him was a maze of structural steel beams and cables. He climbed over the railing of the staircase and stepped out onto a narrow steel beam. This was not a walkway. It was a support beam, part of the tower's skeleton. He reached up and grabbed the beam above his head for balance and began to shimmy sideways, moving away from the safety of the stairs and toward the center of the tower where the elevator shafts were located. There was no safety net below him. If he slipped, he would fall hundreds of feet to the concrete below. If he kept moving forward, he would enter the operational space of the elevators. The engineers who designed the tower never anticipated that a guest would climb a fence, ascend 20 stories of stairs, and then walk out onto a structural beam in the dark. But that is exactly what John did. He shimmied across the beam until he reached the very center of the tower, looking directly down into the open elevator shafts. He stood there on the beam, swaying slightly, looking down at the lights of the park and the dark pits of the shafts. He was likely admiring the view, feeling the adrenaline of the height, but he was standing in a place where mechanical forces were about to shift. Below him, one of the elevator cars began to move. To understand the danger John was in, you have to understand how these elevators worked. They used a counterweight system. A heavy steel cable ran from the top of the elevator car, up to a pulley at the very top of the tower, and then back down to a massive steel weight. This counterweight acted as a balance. When the elevator car went up, the counterweight went down. When the elevator car went down, the counterweight shot up. They moved in perfect opposition, passing each other in the shaft. John was standing on a beam that intersected the path of the counterweight. He was leaning out over the shaft, looking down, completely unaware that the elevator car far below him had just started its descent. As the car went down, the heavy counterweight began to rocket upward. John never saw it coming. The counterweight surged up the shaft, silent and fast. It struck John from below. The impact was not just a blunt collision. The top of the counterweight was a tangle of heavy steel cables and wiring. When it hit John, it lifted him right off the beam. He became entangled in the cables on top of the weight. The force was so violent that it is believed he was impaled on some of the exposed wiring. He was snagged, caught on top of this massive block of moving steel. The elevator operator inside the car felt a sudden jerk. It felt like the car had jumped on its tracks. The operator had no idea that hundreds of feet above him, a teenager had just been scooped up by the counterweight. Fearing a mechanical malfunction, the operator decided to reset the ride. He took the car all the way to the ground floor and let the passengers out. Then, following protocol, he decided to run the car empty all the way to the top to test it and make sure it was safe before letting anyone else on. John was still alive at this point, trapped on top of the counterweight. He was likely struggling desperately to free himself from the cables, terrified and in agony. But he could not get loose. Then, the elevator car at the bottom of the tower began to move again. The operator sent the empty car upward. This meant the counterweight, with John stuck on top of it, began to plummet downward. John was riding the weight down into the darkness of the shaft. The operator watched the floor numbers tick by. The car passed the 50-foot platform. It rose to about 60 feet. Suddenly, there was a deafening thud on the roof of the elevator car. The car shuddered to a violent halt. A split second later, blood began to pour down over the windows of the elevator cab. The operator froze, staring at the red streaks washing over the glass. What had happened was gruesome physics. As the counterweight descended, John's body was hanging off the side of it. As it passed a structural beam, his body caught on the steel. The force of the moving weight pried him loose, ripping him free from the cables. He was thrown off the counterweight and fell freely down the center of the shaft. He fell nearly 200 feet. He landed directly on the roof of the rising elevator car. The impact killed him instantly. Park officials moved with lightning speed. They shut down the ride and cordoned off the area. Police were called immediately. Because the park was closing and the area was already restricted, very few guests realized that a fatal accident had occurred. The police climbed onto the elevator car and found the body of a young man. But there was a problem. John had no ID on him. His wallet was likely in a friend's car or lost during the fall. They had a body, but they had no name. Meanwhile, John's friends were still in the parking lot, getting more and more panicked. The security guard at the gate saw them standing there and approached. They explained that their friend was missing. The guard's face fell. He told them that there had been a serious accident inside the park involving a young man, and the police were trying to identify him. He suggested they go to the local hospital to see if it was their friend. The group drove to the hospital in silence. When they arrived, they were taken to the morgue. There, they had to do the hardest thing of their young lives. They identified the body of John Harder. The night that was supposed to be a celebration of their future had ended with the absolute destruction of one. To this day, nobody knows exactly why John climbed that tower. Some people say it was just the alcohol, a drunken stunt that went tragically wrong. Others have speculated that he was suicidal, though his friends and family adamantly deny this, saying he was happy and looking forward to college. Some think he was just showing off, trying to get a thrill. Whatever the reason, John Harder made a choice to cross a barrier that was there to protect him. He stepped into a machine he did not understand, and it cost him everything. John Harder died because he climbed too high into the open air, seeking a thrill in a place where he was visible to the whole world, but could not be saved. In our next story, a young man also crosses a barrier he should have respected, but instead of climbing up toward the sky, he descends into the dark. And instead of dying where everyone could see him, he vanishes into a small, silent room right under everyone's feet, staying hidden in plain sight while people walked right past him every single day. The campus of Purdue University in West Lafayette, Indiana, can be an unforgiving place in the dead of winter. It is a prestigious school, known for its rigorous academics and excellent athletics, but in January, it is defined by the biting cold of the Midwest. The wind sweeps across the flat plains and cuts through the brick buildings and dormitories. On the evening of January 12, 2007, the semester was just getting started. It was the first Friday of the spring term, and the campus was alive with students shaking off the winter gloom. 19-year-old Wade Steffi was one of those students. He was a freshman on a full academic scholarship, studying aviation technology. He was smart, responsible, and popular. Around 7:20 in the evening, Wade walked into Ford Dining Hall, one of the main eateries on campus. He grabbed a tray of food and found a table with a group of his friends. The atmosphere was loud and happy. Everyone was buzzing about their plans for the weekend, talking about parties and catching up after the winter break. Wade sat there for about an hour, eating and joking around. He seemed perfectly normal, just a college kid enjoying a Friday night. Around 8:20, he stood up to leave. He took his tray to the conveyor belt, said goodbye to his table, and walked out into the cold night air. He did not have far to go. He turned right and walked a very short distance to the building immediately next door, Owen Hall. Owen Hall was a dormitory, but it was not where Wade lived. He was a resident of Cary Quad West, which was on the other side of the dining hall. He was heading to Owen Hall to hang out with some other friends who lived there. He went up to their room, and the group spent the next hour or so just relaxing. They were drinking some alcohol, pre-gaming before heading out for the real events of the night. Wade had a few drinks, but he was in good spirits. Around 9:30, the whole group decided it was time to move. They put on their coats, left the dorm, and began the half-mile walk to a large fraternity party on the west side of campus. The party was huge, a typical college bash with loud music and crowded rooms. Wade stayed there for several hours, mixing with the crowd, but around midnight he realized he had made a mistake. He had left his jacket back at his friend's room in Owen Hall. It was freezing outside, and he needed that coat. He told a friend he was going to run back to get it. He left the fraternity house alone and began the walk back toward the dorms. This is where the night began to go wrong. The dormitories at Purdue, like most universities, are locked down at night for safety. To get into Owen Hall after hours, you either need a key because you live there, or you need someone inside to let you in. Wade did not live there, so he had no key. As he walked, he pulled out his cell phone and started calling people. He was trying to reach anyone inside Owen Hall who could come down and open the door for him. He made 6 phone calls during that walk. It was a frustrating sequence of bad luck. 4 of the calls went to the wrong numbers, people who had no idea who he was or why he was calling them. They just hung up. He did manage to dial 2 people who actually lived in Owen Hall, but neither of them picked up their phones. It was late, the music was loud, or they were already asleep. Wade was striking out. Around 12:30 in the morning, Wade arrived back at Owen Hall. He was cold, a little drunk, and probably annoyed. He put his phone away and walked up to the main entrance. The doors were locked tight. He started knocking on the glass, hoping someone in the lobby or walking by would see him. Eventually, someone did come to the door. A student inside heard the knocking and walked over to the glass. They looked out and saw Wade standing there. Wade did not know this person, and this person did not know Wade. The student inside made a quick judgment call. They decided that Wade looked too intoxicated to be let into the building. They shook their head and refused to open the door. Wade stood there for a moment, knocking again, pleading his case through the glass, but the student walked away. Wade was left standing on the concrete step, shivering, locked out of the building where his coat was waiting. Most people in this situation would have just gone home. Wade lived at Cary Quad West, which was nearby. He could have just walked to his own bed and dealt with the coat in the morning. But in his intoxicated state, Wade became fixated on getting inside Owen Hall. He gave up on the front door and walked around the side of the building, looking for another way in. He turned the corner and found himself on the left side of the dormitory. There, he spotted something that looked promising. It was another door. But this was not a normal student entrance. It was set down low, below ground level. To get to it, you had to climb over a metal safety railing and drop down into a concrete pit. The railing was there specifically to keep people away. It was a clear sign that this area was off limits. But Wade saw a door handle, and in his mind, a door handle meant a way inside. He climbed over the railing and jumped down into the pit. He stood on the concrete slab in front of the door and tried the handle. Amazingly, it turned. The door was unlocked. This was a massive security failure. That door led to a high-voltage utility room and should have been secured at all times. Wade pulled the heavy door open. Inside, it was pitch black. There were no lights on, just the deep, heavy darkness of a windowless room. From the doorway, Wade would have heard the low, menacing hum of heavy machinery. It was the sound of massive electrical transformers doing their work. Wade stepped into the room. He was worried that the heavy door might close behind him and lock, trapping him in the dark. So, he took off one of his shoes. He wedged the shoe into the door jamb to act as a doorstop, keeping the heavy steel door propped open just a crack. Now, with a sliver of light coming from behind him, Wade began to navigate the room. He was not in a hallway or a student lounge. He was in an electrical vault. This room contained 6 massive high-voltage transformers. These machines took raw power from the main grid and stepped it down to usable voltage for the dormitory. They were dangerous, industrial beasts, humming with lethal energy. Wade, unable to see clearly, moved forward blindly. Almost immediately, he bumped into something big and hard. It was one of the transformers. He could not see what it was, but he could feel the metal casing. He assumed it was just an obstacle he had to get around to find the interior door that would lead him upstairs to his jacket. He felt his way along the side of the machine, moving to his left. He thought he could just walk around it, but the machine was huge, and the space was tight. He reached the corner of the transformer and realized there was a narrow gap between the machine and the concrete wall of the room. It was a very tight squeeze. Wade decided to go for it. He turned his body sideways, putting his back against the wall and his chest against the transformer. He began to shimmy through the gap. He was drunk, it was dark, and he was trespassing in a lethal environment. As he shimmied, he held his hands up near his chest and face, protecting himself from the machinery he was pressing against. Suddenly, Wade stumbled. He did not fall to the ground because he was wedged so tightly in the gap, but he slipped. Reflexively, his hands shot out to catch his balance. He grabbed onto the transformer in front of him. It was a 1-in-a-million piece of bad luck. His left hand slapped against the metal casing, and his ring finger slipped directly into a small, 2-inch hole on the side of the unit. This hole was not just a vent. It led directly to the core of the machine. Inside that small hole was an exposed electrical conductor. The tip of Wade's finger touched it. Instantly, between 2,000 and 4,000 volts of electricity surged through his body. To put that in perspective, the electric chair used for executions typically utilizes around 2,000 volts. The current that hit Wade was massive and instantaneous. He likely died the moment his finger made contact. Because of the way he was wedged between the wall and the heavy machine, Wade's body did not fall. He remained standing, held upright by the narrow space, with his finger still locked inside the transformer hole. The door he had come in, which had been propped open by his shoe, eventually shifted. The shoe slipped out of the jamb, and the heavy door swung shut, sealing the room in silence and darkness once again. Wade Steffi was gone. Days passed. On Tuesday, January 16th, Wade's roommate returned to campus. He had been away for the long weekend. When he walked into their dorm room at Cary Quad West, he expected to see Wade. But the room was empty. He sent texts and called Wade's phone, but there was no answer. He started asking around the floor, checking with neighbors. No one had seen Wade since Friday night. The roommate got a bad feeling and called Wade's parents. They had not heard from him either. By the end of the day, the police were involved. They treated it as a missing person case immediately. They pinged Wade's cell phone. The data showed that the phone was still somewhere on the Purdue campus, but the technology was not precise enough to pinpoint a specific room or building. It just told them he was close. A massive search began. Hundreds of volunteers, students, and police officers scoured the grounds. They checked the woods, the basements, and the steam tunnels. Even the equestrian club brought their horses out to help search the rough terrain. 4 days into the search, on January 20th, they found a clue. A search team spotted a lone shoe sitting in the concrete pit outside Owen Hall. It was right next to the door Wade had entered. The police looked at the shoe and looked at the door. They actually opened that exterior door and looked into the electrical vault. But they did not step inside. They peered into the darkness, scanned the area near the door, and saw nothing. Because Wade was wedged behind a transformer deep in the back of the room, he was invisible from the doorway. The police closed the door and moved on. Weeks turned into a month. The official search was eventually scaled back and then called off. Wade had simply vanished. His friends and family were left in a state of agonizing limbo, knowing he was somewhere nearby but unable to find him. The campus moved on, the snow melted, and life returned to normal. But deep inside Owen Hall, something was happening in the electrical vault. 2 months later, on March 19th, a maintenance worker was down in the basement laundry room of Owen Hall. It was a routine shift. As he worked, he heard a strange sound. Pop. It was a sharp, loud cracking noise. At first, he assumed it was coming from one of the clothes dryers. He thought maybe a student had left a lighter or a pen in their pocket, and it was banging around in the drum. He walked down the row of dryers, pressing his ear against them, listening for the noise. Pop. He heard it again, but it was not coming from the machines. He stopped and listened closely. Pop. It was coming from out in the hallway. The worker walked out of the laundry room and stood in the corridor. The sound was louder now. It was coming from behind a heavy steel door, directly across the hall. The worker knew what was behind that door. It was the internal entrance to the high-voltage electrical vault, the same room Wade had entered from the outside 2 months earlier. The worker pulled out his master key ring. He unlocked the door and pushed it open. Immediately, he was hit by a terrible, distinct smell. He stepped into the room to investigate. He looked around the humming transformers, trying to find the source of the popping sound and the odor. He walked deeper into the room than the police had. He moved around the large metal cabinets, and there, wedged between a transformer and the wall, he found Wade Steffi. Wade's body was still in a semi-upright position. The popping sound the worker had heard was electricity. As Wade's body had decomposed and fluids had drained, the electrical resistance had changed. The current was now arcing from his body to the ground, creating a loud, rhythmic snap every time the electricity jumped. The discovery was a shock to the entire university. The investigation revealed that Wade had been there the entire time, while students did laundry just feet away, while police looked through the door, and while his family prayed for answers. Purdue University was found to be negligent for leaving a high-voltage area accessible to the public. They paid a settlement to Wade's family and established a scholarship in his name. But for those who were there, the memory of that popping sound in the laundry room is something they will never forget. Wade Steffi died in the dark, trapped in a small room that nobody looked inside until it was too late. But sometimes, you can see the danger coming from a mile away. You can look right at it, sparkling in the sunlight, and convince yourself that it is not a trap at all, but an adventure. And instead of one person making a fatal mistake in the dark, an entire group of people can make that mistake together, right out in the open, while a camera records every second of it. If you were to look at a map of Central Europe, you would find the small, picturesque country of Slovenia. It is a place defined by its stunning natural beauty, with snow-capped alpine mountains in the north and lush, green valleys that roll toward the coast. Cutting through the heart of this landscape is the Sava River. It is one of the longest rivers in Europe, a powerful ribbon of water that has served as a lifeline for the region for centuries. For the people who live along its banks, the river is a source of pride and recreation. In the town of Sevnica, the river was particularly beloved. Locals would spend their weekends kayaking and canoeing along its gentle currents, enjoying the scenery and the calm water. It was a peaceful existence, but in 2008, things were changing. The government had approved the construction of a massive hydroelectric dam right in the middle of the river. For the town, this meant progress and electricity, but for the people who loved the river, it felt like the end of an era. The dam was going to create a physical barrier across the water, turning what was once a free-flowing journey into a dead end. Kayakers and boaters would no longer be able to travel downstream without stopping, getting out of their boats, and portaging around the massive concrete structure. It was an inconvenience that signaled the end of the river as they knew it. But the mayor of Sevnica saw it differently. He was a strong proponent of the dam, believing it would bring economic growth to his town. However, The mayor also understood the nostalgia of his constituents. He knew that people were sad about losing their open river. So, as the construction of the dam neared its final stages in the summer of 2008, he came up with an idea. He decided to organize one last great adventure. He called it the Final Descent. It would be a ceremonial canoe trip down the river, passing the construction site one last time before the dam became fully operational and blocked the way forever. He spent weeks organizing the event, reaching out to friends, colleagues, and local officials. He wanted it to be a celebration, a way to say goodbye to the old river and welcome the new future. He managed to recruit 27 other people to join him. These were prominent members of the community, people who trusted the mayor and looked forward to being part of a historic local moment. They planned to take 4 large canoes, with 7 people in each boat. On the morning of July 3, 2008, the group gathered at a loading area upstream from the dam. The weather was absolutely perfect. The sun was shining, the air was warm, and the river was calm and inviting. It felt like the perfect day for a boat ride. The mood was festive. People were laughing, shaking hands, and taking photos. The construction company that was building the dam had even provided the canoes for the event. As the group prepared to launch, the staff offered everyone life jackets. It was a standard safety precaution for anyone going out on the water, but nearly everyone in the group declined. They looked at the calm water, they looked at the beautiful blue sky, and they decided they did not need them. They were just going for a leisurely paddle, not running whitewater rapids. It was a decision made in casual confidence, the kind of decision that seems harmless in the moment but looks horrifying in retrospect. The mayor had also hired a professional photographer to document the journey. He wanted high-quality images of this final descent to put in the town archives. The photographer loaded his gear into one of the canoes, and the group pushed off from the shore. The 4 boats drifted out into the current, their paddles dipping rhythmically into the water. For the first 15 or 20 minutes, everything went exactly according to plan. The scenery was beautiful, the conversation was lively, and the river carried them gently downstream. But as they rounded a bend in the river, the mood began to shift. About 1,000 feet ahead of them, the dam came into view. It was not finished yet, but the massive concrete skeleton was largely in place. It stretched across the entire width of the river, a gray wall interrupting the blue water. Even from a distance, the group could see the water flowing through the large cement archways of the spillway. The mayor had been assured by the construction crew that there would be a way through. He had been told that, on the left side of the dam, there was a section of the river that had not yet been blocked off. The plan was to steer the canoes toward that open channel and glide right past the construction site. But as they got closer, paddling toward the structure, it became obvious that the information was wrong. There was no open channel on the left. The dam blocked the entire river. The group stopped paddling and let the canoes drift for a moment. They were now facing a choice. The river was slow enough that they were not in immediate danger of being swept away. They could have paddled to the bank, climbed out, and walked around the dam. That would have been the safe, logical choice. But they were there for an adventure. They were there for the final descent. Getting out and walking felt like a defeat. The mayor and a few others in the lead canoes looked at the dam. It was not a towering Hoover Dam-style structure with a massive drop. It was a run-of-the-river dam, relatively low to the water. The spillway looked like a gentle concrete slope, maybe 10 or 15 feet long, leading down to the water below. To the people in the boats, it looked like a water slide. They started to talk amongst themselves. "Why don't we just go over it?" someone suggested. It seemed like a fun idea. They could just paddle up to the edge, slide down the concrete ramp, and splash into the water at the bottom. It would be the highlight of the trip, a thrilling end to their journey. The construction crew had explicitly warned people not to go near the spillways, but looking at it from the calm water above, the danger did not seem real. It looked manageable. It looked like fun. 3 of the 4 canoes decided to go for it. The excitement of the group overrode their caution. They rearranged themselves in the boats, getting ready for the slide. The 4th canoe, however, was not so sure. The people in that boat looked at the churning water at the bottom of the spillway and decided they did not want to risk it. The photographer was in this 4th canoe. He suggested that they pull over to the bank on the left side, and he would get out to film the others going down. It was agreed. The 4th canoe paddled to the shore, and the photographer hopped out with his camera. He scrambled up the bank to get a good vantage point. He wanted to capture the moment his friends came sliding down the dam, laughing and splashing. He set up his shot, focusing his lens on the sleek gray curve of the spillway. On the water, the other 3 canoes lined up for their approach. The first canoe steered toward the center of the spillway. Inside were 7 people, including the mayor. In the video footage that was later recovered, you can see their faces. They look excited. There is a sense of nervous anticipation, like children at the top of a playground slide. They paddle forward, gaining a little speed to clear the lip of the dam. They enter the shadow of the concrete archway, moving from the bright sunlight into the gloom of the spillway tunnels. As they cross the threshold, the nose of the canoe dips forward. Gravity takes over. The boat begins to slide down the wet concrete ramp. In the video, you see the back of the canoe kick up as it hits the angle of the slope. For a split second, it looks exactly like the fun ride they had imagined. Then, you hear a scream. It is not a scream of excitement. It is a scream of pure, sudden terror. And then, the video cuts out. What happened at the bottom of that slide was a nightmare of physics and engineering. When the canoe hit the water at the base of the dam, it did not just splash and float away. It capsized instantly. All 7 people were thrown violently into the water. But this was not normal river water. This was the outflow of a hydroelectric plant. Directly beneath the surface, massive turbines were spinning, or intake tunnels were open, creating a powerful, invisible suction. The water at the base of the dam was a hydraulic jump, a churning, aerated foam that provides no buoyancy. Even if they had been wearing life jackets, they might have struggled to stay afloat. Without them, they had no chance. But worse than the foam was the suction. The intake tunnels beneath the water acted like giant vacuums. As soon as the passengers hit the water, they were grabbed by an irresistible force and pulled straight down. They did not even have time to take a breath. One moment they were sliding down a concrete ramp in the sunshine, and the next they were being dragged into the dark, crushing depths of the dam's internal machinery. The mayor, the officials, the friends, they were all gone in seconds. They were pulled through the dark tunnels, battered against the concrete and steel, and drowned in the black water beneath the dam. Meanwhile, the people in the second canoe had no idea what had just happened. They were right behind the first boat. They saw their friends disappear over the edge, and they assumed everything was fine. They lined up their canoe and paddled over the lip. They slid down the ramp, picking up speed, heading straight for the same patch of churning white water. They hit the bottom, and just like the first boat, they capsized instantly. 7 more people were thrown into the water. 7 more people were grabbed by the underwater current. 7 more people were sucked down into the tunnels. In less than a minute, 14 people had vanished into the machinery of the dam. The river surface was left churning and empty, swallowing them whole without leaving a trace. The third canoe was a little further back. They had paused to watch the others. As they drifted toward the edge, they expected to see their friends popping up in the water below, waving and laughing. But when they looked down, they saw nothing. The water was empty. Then they saw debris. A paddle floated up, a piece of a broken canoe bobbed in the foam. Then they saw the overturned hull, of one of the boats tumbling in the wash. Panic set in. The people in the third canoe realized something was terribly wrong. They back-paddled frantically, fighting the current to stay away from the edge. They managed to steer their boat over to the side, avoiding the slide. They looked down into the horror below, searching for heads bobbing in the water, searching for anyone to save. But there was no one. The river had taken them all. The photographer on the bank lowered his camera. He had been ready to film a celebration. Instead, he had witnessed a massacre. He stood there on the shore, helpless, watching the empty water swirl at the base of the dam. The silence that followed the screams was heavy and absolute. The only sound was the roar of the water rushing through the spillway, the sound of the machine that had just consumed 14 lives. The rescue effort began almost immediately, but it was not really a rescue. It was a recovery. Police divers and emergency teams arrived at the scene, but the conditions at the base of the dam were treacherous. The same currents that had sucked the victims in made it incredibly dangerous for divers to enter the water. They had to shut down the operations of the dam, stopping the flow of water to make it safe enough to search. Over the next several days, the divers pulled bodies from the river. They found them caught in the grates of the intake tunnels. They found them trapped in the underwater machinery. One of the victims was found 25 miles downstream, carried all the way across the border into Croatia by the river's current. The town of Sevnica was plunged into mourning. They had lost their mayor and a dozen other prominent citizens in a single afternoon. In the end, 13 of the 14 people who went over the dam died. The only survivor was the mayor's wife. By some miracle of hydrodynamics, when she fell into the water, the current spat her out instead of sucking her down. She managed to claw her way to the surface and was pulled to shore, gasping and traumatized. She was the sole witness to what it felt like to be inside that washing machine of death. The final descent was supposed to be a farewell to the river. It became a farewell to the people who loved it. They had looked at a deadly industrial machine and tricked themselves into seeing a playground slide. They had ignored the warnings, refused the safety gear, and paddled straight into a trap of their own making. The Sava River flows on today, blocked by the dam, carrying the memory of the day the town's leaders vanished beneath its surface. The victims in our last story died because they were pulled down into the cold, churning water of a river, drowning in the dark machinery of a dam. They were surrounded by liquid that should have been safe, but turned deadly. In our next story, a group of men also face a wave of liquid. But this liquid is not water, it is not cold, and instead of drowning them in the dark, it will burn them in the blinding light of a man-made hell. In the spring of 2017, 21-year-old Antonio Navarrete was living his best life. He lived in Wimauma, Florida, a quiet rural suburb just south of Tampa. Antonio was a simple guy with a clear passion. Since he was a toddler, he had been obsessed with cars. He loved taking his toy cars apart and putting them back together. As he got older, he started drawing intricate designs of vehicles he dreamed of building. By the time he was an adult, that passion had focused on a single prized possession, a white Chevy lowrider pickup truck. He called the truck Casper. He had poured every spare dollar he had into it. He tricked it out with custom lights, special rims, and a massive sound system that took up most of the back seat. Casper was his pride and joy, and it was actually thanks to this truck that his life had taken its best turn yet. A year earlier, Antonio had driven Casper to a local car meetup. He was standing by his truck when he spotted a beautiful young woman across the lot. Her name was Daisy Martinez. Antonio was shy. He was not the kind of guy who usually walked up to strangers, but he could not help staring at her. Daisy noticed him looking, and instead of turning away, she smiled. That smile was the beginning of everything for them. They started dating, and within a year, they were inseparable. Now, in the spring of 2017, they had even bigger news. Daisy was pregnant. They were going to start a family. They were currently living with Antonio's parents, saving money so they could get their own place before the baby arrived. Antonio wanted to be a mechanic eventually, but with a baby on the way, he needed better money right now. He managed to land a job with a contractor that did maintenance work for the Tampa Electric Company. The job was at the Big Bend power plant in Apollo Beach, about 10 miles east of his home. It was not his dream job, but it paid $12 an hour. That was nearly double what he was used to making. His friends who worked there told him it was easy money. They said he would mostly just ride around on golf carts, picking up trash. It sounded perfect. On June 24th, Antonio kissed Daisy goodbye, hopped into Casper, and drove to the plant for his first day. When he arrived at Big Bend, he was stunned by the sheer scale of the place. It was a massive industrial complex, sitting right on the water's edge. 4 gigantic smokestacks rose from the roof, billowing white smoke into the Florida sky. The plant generated electricity by burning coal. Inside the factory, the noise was deafening. It was a maze of pipes, catwalks, and heavy machinery. It was hot, loud, and dangerous, but Antonio was ready to work. The heart of the plant consisted of 4 distinct power units. Each unit was built around a massive boiler, essentially a 12-story tall oven. Coal was fed into these boilers and burned at incredible temperatures to create steam, which then spun the turbines to make electricity. But burning coal creates a byproduct called ash. In the newer units, this ash was captured as dust. But 3 of the units at Big Bend were older models from the 1970s. They handled the ash differently. In these older boilers, the heat was so intense that the ash melted. It turned into a substance called slag. Slag is basically molten rock. It is man-made lava. Inside the boiler, this glowing, liquid rock would drip down the walls and pool at the bottom. There was a man-sized hole at the base of the boiler where the slag would drain out. It would fall into a 30-foot-tall water tank called a cooling chamber. When the red-hot slag hit the water, it would hiss and harden instantly, turning into black, glassy rocks. At the bottom of the water tank, there was a heavy-duty grinder. This machine would crush the slag rocks into small chips, which were then pumped out and sold to companies that used them for roofing shingles or sandpaper. It was a brutal, efficient system. Molten lava in, black rocks out. Antonio spent his first few days just learning the layout, watching safety videos, and doing light cleanup. He felt like he had a handle on things. Thursday, June 29th, was his 4th day on the job. Antonio woke up in a great mood. The next day, Friday, Daisy was scheduled for an ultrasound. They were going to find out if they were having a boy or a girl. Antonio was buzzing with excitement. He ate a quick breakfast, hugged Daisy, and drove Casper to the plant. He had no idea that the massive machine he was walking into was already malfunctioning. Inside Unit 2, a serious problem had developed. In the boiler, the molten slag had stopped draining properly. Instead of flowing through the hole at the bottom, it had clogged. A plug of solidifying slag had formed over the opening, but the boiler was still running. The coal was still burning, and new slag was still being created every second. It had nowhere to go, so it just kept building up inside the boiler, tons of molten rock pooling above the clog. Simultaneously, there was a second problem directly below the boiler in the cooling tank. The slag rocks that had fallen earlier had jammed the grinder at the bottom of the tank. So, the system was blocked at both ends. The boiler was filling up with lava, and the tank below was choked with rocks. The plant managers knew they had to fix it. If they didn't, Unit 2 would shut down. There was a safe way to do this repair. The safe way was to turn off the boiler. They could shut down the fire, let the unit cool, and then break up the clogs without the risk of active lava flowing above their heads. But turning off a boiler is incredibly expensive. It costs the power company a fortune in lost electricity and time. So, the decision was made to keep the boiler running. They were going to clear the blockage while the fire was still burning and the slag was still melting directly above them. This was not the first time the company had done this. They had asked employees to perform this dangerous procedure before, and nothing bad had happened. So, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a senior plant manager gathered a team of 5 men, including Antonio. Their orders were to go to the bottom of Unit 2 and clear the grinder blockage. The plan was straightforward but terrifying. First, they drained all the water out of the 30-foot cooling tank. Now, the tank was just a dry, empty metal silo. Near the bottom of the tank, there was a rectangular access panel known as the doghouse door. The team was going to open this door. Then, they would stand outside and use high-pressure water cannons to blast the slag rocks inside the tank, trying to break them loose from the grinder. It sounds insane to do this, while a pool of lava is sitting just 30 feet above your head, held back only by a fragile clog. But the men trusted their supervisors. They trusted the routine. They gathered their gear and headed to Unit 2. Antonio's role was simple. He was not running a water cannon. He was there for cleanup support. He stood about 10 or 15 feet back from the open door, watching the other men work. The scene was industrial and chaotic. The air was hot. The sound of the water cannons blasting into the hollow metal tank would have been incredibly loud. Above them, the 12-story boiler was roaring, burning coal at over 1,000 degrees. The men took turns spraying the water, trying to chip away at the rocks in the darkness of the tank. They worked for about 20 minutes. They were making progress. Antonio was likely standing there, maybe checking his watch, thinking about the ultrasound appointment the next day. He was just the new guy, standing back, waiting to sweep up. He was a spectator to the work. But inside the boiler above them, the physics of the situation were reaching a breaking point. The pool of molten slag above the clog had grown too heavy. The pressure was immense. Suddenly, without any warning, the clog in the boiler gave way. The plug shattered. Instantly, tons of liquid slag, thousands of gallons of molten lava, came crashing down through the hole. It fell 30 feet through the empty cooling tank. If the tank had been full of water, it might have absorbed some of the energy, but the tank was empty. The avalanche of lava hit the bottom of the tank with explosive force. It slammed into the floor and rebounded. It hit the back wall of the tank and curled upward, looking for an exit. The only way out was the open doghouse door. The lava surged toward the opening. It shot out of the door like a cannon blast, a horizontal geyser of molten rock and superheated steam. The wave of slag hit the men before they could even scream. It was a tidal wave of hellfire. It covered the ground in an instant, spreading out 40 feet in every direction. The substance was heavy, sticky, and unimaginably hot. It was not like water that splashes off. It was like heavy syrup made of fire. The floor was instantly covered in 6 inches of slag. The men who were standing closest to the door were engulfed immediately. Their clothes caught fire, and their skin began to burn. They tried to run, but you cannot run in lava. As soon as they stepped, their boots melted, their feet sank into the molten layer. It was like quicksand that burned through bone. Antonio tried to run. He turned and scrambled away from the door, but the wave was too fast. It caught his legs. He fell forward, landing in the slag. He was lying on his side, his body partially submerged in the molten material. The heat was absolute. The steam filled the air, searing his lungs with every breath. He was trapped, unable to stand, unable to crawl, melting into the floor of the power plant. In that moment of ultimate horror, facing a death that is too painful to imagine, Antonio did something heartbreaking. He reached into his pocket with his free hand. He pulled out his cell phone. He dialed his mother. She did not pick up. The call went to voicemail. Antonio left a message. It was short. He screamed into the phone, "Mom, Mom, I'm burning. Please call the cops. Please, Mom." In the background of the recording, you can hear the terrifying roar of the steam and the hissing of the cooling slag. You can hear the sound of a nightmare coming true. 5 of the 6 men on that team died. They were cooked alive in the shadow of the machine they were trying to fix. The rescue teams could not even get to them immediately because the floor was still covered in lava. They had to wait for it to cool down before they could recover the bodies. Antonio Navarrete was 21 years old. He went to work to save money for his baby. He died because a company wanted to save money on a shutdown. His truck, Casper, was found in the parking lot, waiting for a driver who would never come back. And somewhere on a server, a voicemail remains, a final, desperate plea from a son to his mother, recorded in the middle of a man-made volcano. Antonio Navarrete died because the industrial vessel he was standing next to could not contain the superheated pressure inside it. The liquid rock burst out and consumed him. In our next story, 2 men face the exact opposite problem. They are trapped inside an industrial vessel that is working too well. It is holding the pressure perfectly. But instead of keeping the danger out, it has locked them in with it. And instead of burning up in seconds, they will have hours to think about what is happening to them in the dark. To understand how a human being can disappear into the crushing depths of the ocean and live to tell about it, you have to understand the strange physics of saturation diving. Most people think you can just put on a scuba tank, swim down to the bottom of the sea, and swim back up whenever you want. But that is not how the human body works. When you dive deep, the air you breathe is compressed. It is usually a mixture of oxygen, helium, and nitrogen. As you breathe it under pressure, those gases are absorbed into your blood. If you swim back to the surface too fast, those gases expand. Your body becomes like a shaken-up soda can that is suddenly opened. The bubbles form in your blood and tissues. This is called decompression sickness, or the bends, and it can kill you instantly. To avoid this, divers have to ascend very slowly, letting the gases leave their bodies naturally. From a depth of 2,000 feet, it would take more than 33 hours to come up safely. That is obviously not practical for a construction worker who needs to go to work every day. So, oil and gas companies use saturation divers. These men live in a pressurized chamber on the deck of a ship for weeks at a time. The chamber is kept at the same pressure as the ocean floor, where they are working. They sleep, eat, and use the bathroom inside this small metal tube. When it is time to work, they transfer into a smaller diving bell that is lowered into the water. Because their bodies are already saturated with pressurized gas, they can step out onto the seabed, do their job, and then go back up to their pressurized home without decompressing. It is an efficient system, but it is a terrifying way to live. Saturation divers work in a world of perpetual night. The sunlight does not reach the depths where they operate. The water is freezing cold, so their suits are pumped with hot water from the surface just to keep them from dying of hypothermia. The visibility is often near zero, like shining a flashlight into thick fog, and they are not alone down there. Large fish sometimes huddle near the divers, using their lights to hide from even larger predators that circle in the darkness. But the thing that scares saturation divers the most is not the dark or the sharks. It is the idea of a lost bell. The diving bell is their elevator to the underworld. It hangs from the ship by a thick steel cable. If that cable snaps, the bell falls to the bottom of the ocean. The divers inside are trapped in a small steel sphere with limited oxygen, no heat, and no way to communicate. They are cut off from the entire world. On August 7, 1979, Richard Walker was living inside a saturation chamber on a ship in the North Sea. He had been in saturation for 10 days, and the isolation was getting to him. Richard was a family man. He missed his wife and his 15-month-old daughter. He was tired of the cramped quarters and the constant pressure. That evening, Before his shift began, he opened his journal and wrote a single, haunting sentence: "Dear God, I just want to get out." Shortly after writing that note, Richard and his partner, Victor Giel, suited up. They crawled into the diving bell to begin their shift. The crew on the deck prepared to lower them into the water. But right before they launched, a technician noticed a problem. The location transponder, a device that beams the bell's exact location to the ship, was loose. Instead of fixing it, the crew decided to just remove it. They figured they did not need it. It was a decision that would prove fatal. The bell was lowered into the black water. It descended to a working depth of 485 feet. Once they were in position, the divers opened the hatch at the bottom of the bell. Because the pressure inside matched the pressure of the water outside, the water did not rush in. It just formed a pool at their feet. They took turns dropping out of the bell to work on the underwater structure. At 2:45 in the morning, Richard was outside the bell. Victor was inside monitoring the systems. Suddenly, Richard heard a strange noise. He turned around and saw the diving bell tilt to the side. At the same moment, his radio crackled. The topside crew ordered him to get back inside immediately. Something was wrong with the ship's positioning system. Richard scrambled back into the bell and sealed the hatch. As the two men sat there, the main steel cable connecting them to the ship snapped. The bell jerked. For a moment, it was held by the umbilical, the bundle of hoses that supplied their power, heat, and breathing gas. But the umbilical was not designed to hold the weight of the heavy steel bell. The crew on the surface tried to winch them up by the hoses, but it was too heavy. The umbilical snapped. Richard and Victor were now in free fall. The diving bell plummeted through the water and slammed into the seabed. They were nearly 500 feet down. The impact was jarring, but they were alive. However, they immediately realized they were in a worst-case scenario. Normally, a diving bell has a clump weight attached to the bottom by a short chain. This weight keeps the bell off the seafloor, so even if it falls, the escape hatch is not blocked. But their company had cut corners. There was no clump weight. The weights were bolted directly to the bell itself. When they hit the bottom, the bell landed flush against the mud. The bottom hatch was pressed tight against the ocean floor. Richard and Victor could not open the door. They could not perform a wet transfer to a rescue bell. They were sealed inside a steel tomb. The conditions inside the bell began to deteriorate instantly. When the umbilical snapped, they lost their hot water supply. The North Sea is incredibly cold, and the steel walls of the bell conducted the heat away from their bodies rapidly. They also lost their external light. They were sitting in absolute freezing darkness, and they had lost their main oxygen supply. They only had the emergency gas tanks attached to the bell, which would not last long. Up on the surface, panic set in. Another diving ship was nearby and raced to the scene to help. But because the crew had removed the transponder earlier that night, the rescue ship had no way of knowing exactly where the bell was. It lay somewhere in the darkness below, a tiny needle in a massive haystack. It took the rescue ship 3 hours just to get their divers into the water. Then, the divers had to swim around blindly, searching for the lost bell. It took an hour of searching, but they finally found it. It was 7 o'clock in the morning. The rescue divers swam up to the small glass porthole on the side of the bell and shined their lights inside. Richard and Victor were huddled together in the cold, but they were conscious. They gave the rescuers a thumbs up. They were alive. They knew help had arrived, and they thought they were going home. This news was relayed to the surface. The mood on the ship turned from despair to elation. The supervisors were so confident that they called Richard's wife. They told her there had been an accident, but that the divers had found the bell, and Richard was fine. They told her he would be safe on the surface very soon. It was a promise they should not have made. The rescue operation turned into a nightmare. The rescue ship on the surface was struggling to hold its position in the rough seas. Every time the rescue divers tried to attach a new lift wire to the top of the sunken bell, the ship would drift and they would be pulled away. For 2 hours, they fought the current and the equipment, failing again and again to secure the line. Inside the bell, Richard and Victor were freezing to death. The temperature was dropping, and the air was becoming toxic as the carbon dioxide levels rose and the oxygen ran out. The rescue divers kept swimming back to the porthole to check on them. At first, the men inside were responsive, but as the hours dragged on, their movements became slower. The cold was shutting down their bodies. By 9 o'clock in the morning, 6 hours after the crash, the rescue divers looked through the glass again. This time, there was no thumbs up. Richard and Victor were sitting with their heads in their hands. They were despondent. They knew what was happening. They could see the rescuers outside fumbling with the cables, failing to connect them. They realized that the rescue was taking too long. They were going to die in the dark, watching their salvation float just inches away. Finally, the rescue divers managed to secure the new lift wire. They gave the signal to the surface. The winch began to turn. The bell lifted off the seabed. Richard and Victor were coming up, but then disaster struck again. The strain on the new wire was too much. With a loud snap, the cable broke. The diving bell plummeted back down to the ocean floor, crashing into the mud for the second time. Everyone on the surface knew that was the end. The physics of hypothermia and asphyxiation were undeniable, but they kept trying. It took hours to rig another line. The rescue divers went down again to check the porthole. Richard and Victor were no longer sitting up. They were lying on their sides on the floor of the bell. They were not moving. They had stopped looking out the window. Eventually, the crew managed to lift the bell to the surface. They hoisted it onto the deck of the ship and cracked open the hatch. The medical team rushed in, but it was too late. Richard Walker and Victor Giel were dead. They had survived the fall, survived the impact, and survived hours of waiting. They had seen the rescue divers face to face. But a series of cut corners, a missing transponder, a missing clump weight, and a faulty wire had doomed them. Richard's wife, who had been told her husband was safe, received a second phone call. The voice on the other end had to explain that the previous update was wrong. Richard was not coming home. His journal entry from that evening was the last thing he ever wrote. He had asked God to help him get out. In the end, his prayer was answered, but not in the way he had hoped. He left the chamber, but he never left the sea. The 2 men in our last story died because they were locked out of the world, hidden in the dark, while people on the surface frantically tried to find them. In this next story, a young woman also vanishes while people are looking for her. But when she is finally found, the mystery does not end. Instead, her discovery kicks off a twisted investigation where the person tasked with finding the truth decides to invent his own version of it, nearly letting a monster walk free forever. We leave the freezing, crushing depths of the North Sea now. The camera rises up through the dark water, breaking the surface and flying west across the Atlantic Ocean. It passes over the coastline, drifts over the Appalachian Mountains, and descends into the flat, gray landscape of the American Midwest. It settles on a vast asphalt parking lot in Clyde, Ohio. It is just after 6 o'clock in the morning on April 9th, 2015. The air is cold and damp, and the shift change whistle has just blown at the Whirlpool manufacturing plant. Heather Bogle walked out of the factory doors, exhausted. She was 28 years old and a single mother to a 5-year-old daughter named Mackenzie. Heather worked the overnight shift at the plant to make ends meet. It was grueling work, but she did it for her little girl. As she walked across the parking lot toward her car, she probably pulled her coat tighter against the chill. She was looking forward to going home, getting some sleep, and then picking up Mackenzie from school later that afternoon. Heather was known for her resilience. She was a fighter. Just days earlier, she had received some bad news. She had failed a nursing exam she had been studying hard for. It was a major setback, and it weighed heavily on her mind. But Heather was not the type to give up. She had plans to retake it. She had dreams of a better life. She got into her car, started the engine, and drove out of the lot. She turned onto the main road, heading toward her home in Ballville Township. That was the last time anyone saw Heather Bogle alive. Later that afternoon, the bell rang at Mackenzie's elementary school. The children flooded out, running to their parents' cars. Mackenzie stood waiting. She watched the cars come and go, but her mother never arrived. This was completely out of character. Heather was a devoted mother. She never missed a pickup, and she never went radio silent. Teachers waited with the little girl. They called Heather's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. They called family members. Panic began to set in immediately. Heather's family knew something was wrong. She was responsible. She would not just abandon her daughter. By that evening, a missing person report was filed. The police began to search, pinging her phone and looking for her vehicle. The next day, April 10th, the search ended in the worst possible way. Heather's car was found parked in the lot of the Somerton Apartments in Sandusky County. It was just sitting there, silent and still. When investigators approached the vehicle, they noticed nothing unusual about the exterior. But when they popped the trunk, they found a scene that would haunt them for years. Heather Bogle was inside. She was curled up in a fetal position. At first glance, she looked almost peaceful, like she was sleeping. But the details that emerged were nightmarish. Heather was wearing an oversized red Mickey Mouse t-shirt. Her family confirmed immediately that she did not own that shirt. It belonged to someone else. Someone had dressed her in it after she died. Even more disturbing was what had been done to her body. Her hair, which she took pride in, had been hacked off. It looked like someone had taken a dull pocket knife and sawed through her hair in rough, jagged chunks, leaving it uneven and short. Her fingernails had been clipped down to the quick, so short that the skin was raw. It was a meticulous, bizarre attempt to remove evidence. An autopsy revealed the cause of death. Heather had been shot twice in the back. The bullets had pierced her vital organs. But before she died, she had fought like a warrior. Her hands and arms were covered in defensive bruises. She had punched, scratched, and blocked blows. She had not gone quietly. She had made her killer work for it. After she was dead, the killer had cleaned her body with chemical wipes, trying to scrub away any DNA. The case landed on the desk of Detective Sean O'Connell of the Sandusky County Sheriff's Office. O'Connell was a veteran investigator, and the community looked to him to solve this brutal crime. He started by looking at Heather's life. He found out she had recently broken up with a girlfriend named Carmela Badillo. O'Connell brought Carmela in and grilled her. But Carmela had an alibi. She was cleared quickly. Then, O'Connell's investigation took a strange turn. He received a tip about a woman named Kiona Bohr. Kiona lived near the apartment complex where Heather's car was found. O'Connell fixated on her. He decided that Kiona, along with two of her friends, Omar Satchel and Carrie Jefferson, were responsible. He built a theory that this was a drug deal gone wrong, or some kind of gang-related hit. There was just one problem. There was zero physical evidence linking these three people to the murder. Their DNA was not on Heather's body. Their fingerprints were not in her car. But O'Connell did not let that stop him. He was convinced he was right. He started harassing them. He named them as suspects in the local newspaper. He told the public they were involved in Heather's death. The consequences for these three innocent people were devastating. Kiona lost her job. She was evicted from her apartment. Her neighbors looked at her with disgust. People sent her death threats on social media, calling her a monster. She had to pull her children out of school because they were being bullied. O'Connell had effectively ruined their lives based on nothing but his own hunch. O'Connell even claimed he had evidence that the murder weapon had been thrown into a nearby river by one of the suspects. He wasted taxpayer money sending dive teams into the water, searching for a gun that was never there. He ignored tips that pointed in other directions. He was tunneling on his theory, bending the facts to fit his narrative. For 2 years, the case stalled. The real killer was still out there, free, while O'Connell chased ghosts and tormented innocent citizens. Everything changed when a new sheriff, Chris Hilton, was elected. Sheriff Hilton took one look at the Heather Bogle file and realized it was a mess. He saw that the investigation had been botched from day one. He did something O'Connell had refused to do. He started over. He treated the case as if the murder had happened yesterday. He brought in state investigators and went back to the raw data. The new team looked at the digital evidence. They pulled the GPS data from Heather's phone on the day she disappeared. The data showed exactly where she went after she left the Whirlpool plant. She did not go to her apartment. She did not go to a drug deal. She drove to a trailer park just a few miles from the factory. Her phone signal stopped moving at a specific address, lot number 24. This trailer belonged to a man named Daniel Myers. Myers was 49 years old and worked at the same Whirlpool plant as Heather. They were co-workers. They had clocked out around the same time that morning. Sheriff Hilton and his team dug into Myers' background. They found that he had a history of strange behavior toward women, but he had flown under the radar. The investigators obtained a search warrant for Myers' trailer. When they went inside, the pieces of the puzzle finally started to snap together. They found that the floorboards in the trailer had been replaced recently. Myers had ripped up the old floor and put down new wood. He had also bought a brand new mattress shortly after Heather died. He was cleaning up a crime scene. Then came the forensic breakthrough. Remember how Heather's fingernails had been clipped down to the quick? The killer had done that to remove any skin or blood she might have scratched off him during her fight. But he had missed something. Deep under one of her cuticles, a microscopic amount of DNA remained. The lab tested it. It was a match for Daniel Myers. The story of what happened that morning finally became clear. Heather had likely given Myers a ride home, or he had lured her to his trailer under some false pretense. Once inside, he made a move on her. Heather, who was tired and just wanted to go home to her daughter, rejected him. Myers did not take the rejection well. He snapped. He attacked her. But Heather fought back. She fought hard. She punched him in the face, scratching him and likely causing the injuries that led him to clip her nails later. Myers was stronger, though. He overpowered her. He handcuffed her and beat her. Then he shot her in the back. He spent the next few hours cleaning up. He washed her body. He dressed her in the Mickey Mouse shirt, which likely belonged to his own family, or was just something he had lying around. He hacked off her hair to hide forensic evidence. Then, he put her in the trunk of her own car and drove it to the apartment complex to dump it. He walked away, thinking he had committed the perfect crime. He even had the audacity to attend Heather's funeral. He signed the guest book. He looked her crying family in the eye and offered his condolences. He even donated money to the GoFundMe campaign for Heather's daughter. He was hiding in plain sight, playing the role of the grieving coworker. When the police arrested Daniel Myers in 2017, the community was shocked. He looked like a normal, quiet guy. But the evidence was overwhelming. Faced with the DNA match and the GPS data, Myers knew he was cornered. Prosecutors made it clear they were going to seek the death penalty. Myers, a coward to the end, decided to make a deal. To save his own life, he pleaded guilty to aggravated murder, kidnapping, and robbery. In February 2019, nearly 4 years after Heather died, Daniel Myers stood in a courtroom. He was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. He will die in a concrete cell. But justice did not stop there. The system turned its eyes toward the man who had allowed Myers to walk free for 2 years. Detective Sean O'Connell was investigated for his handling of the case. It was revealed that he had falsified reports, misled prosecutors, and deliberately ignored evidence to frame Kiana Bohr and her friends. He was charged with tampering with evidence. In a rare moment of accountability, the detective was sentenced to 2 years in prison. He went from being the law to being an inmate, sitting in a cell just like the people he used to arrest. The innocent suspects, Kiana, Omar, and Carrie, were fully exonerated, but the damage to their reputations will last forever. They lost years of their lives to stress and fear because of a lazy, corrupt investigation. Heather Bogle's story is a tragedy, but it is also a testament to her spirit. In her final moments, she fought so hard that she literally carried the identity of her killer under her fingernails. She held on to that truth even after death. It took a new sheriff and a rebooted investigation to find it, but in the end, Heather Bogle solved her own murder. Heather Bogle died because a predator hid his true nature behind a mask of normalcy, and a detective refused to look behind it. The danger was there, but it was concealed in the shadows of a trailer park and buried under false leads. In our next story, the danger was not hidden at all. It was standing right in front of everyone, announcing exactly what it was going to do. The victim did everything she was supposed to do. She reported the threat, she got the legal paperwork, she followed the rules. But she learned the hard way that a piece of paper cannot stop a man who has decided that if he cannot have her, nobody can. The city of Melbourne, Australia, is usually associated with culture, coffee, and a relaxed coastal lifestyle. In November of 2020, the city was just shaking off the chill of winter and moving into the warmth of the southern summer. For the Mano family, this season was supposed to be a time of celebration. Celeste Mano was 23 years old, a vibrant young woman with a wide, radiant smile and a spirit that drew people to her. She was just days away from her 24th birthday, a milestone she was excitedly planning for. Celeste lived at home with her mother, Aggie, in the northeastern suburbs of the city. Their bond was incredibly close, the kind of mother-daughter relationship that is built on deep friendship as much as family duty. Even at 23, Celeste still loved the comfort of her mother's presence. Every night, before she went to sleep, her mother would come into her room to tuck her in. It was a sweet, enduring ritual, a kiss on the forehead, an exchange of "I love you," and the promise of a new day. It was the kind of safety that felt unbreakable. But outside the walls of that warm, loving home, a cold obsession had been growing for more than a year. It started in a place that is usually mundane and uneventful, a call center. In 2019, Celeste was working at a customer service center. She was known among her colleagues as the nice one, the person who was always empathetic and kind, regardless of who she was talking to. Working alongside her was a man named Louis Sacco. He was 35 years old, more than a decade older than Celeste. Sacco was not doing well at the job. He struggled with the work and did not fit in with the team. Eventually, the management decided to let him go. On the day he was fired, most people would have just let him walk out the door alone. It is an awkward, shameful moment, and colleagues usually look away. But Celeste was not most people. She saw a human being who was having a terrible day. She decided to walk him out of the building, offering him some kind words and a bit of dignity on his way to the parking lot. When they reached the exit, Sacco stopped. He turned to Celeste and, without asking, he leaned in and kissed her on the cheek. He thanked her for her kindness. To Celeste, it was a little weird, an invasion of personal space, but she probably wrote it off as an awkward goodbye from a socially clumsy guy. She assumed she would never see him again. But for Sacco, that small act of basic human decency sparked a delusion that would consume him. Sacco had never had a girlfriend. At 35, he had never experienced an intimate relationship. When Celeste showed him kindness, his mind twisted it into something else. He decided that he was in love with her. He decided that they were meant to be together. The fact that she was just being professional and polite did not matter to him. He built a fantasy world where she was the central figure, and he began to pursue it with a terrifying intensity. A week after he was fired, the messages started. Sako found Celeste on Instagram. He sent her long, rambling declarations of his feelings. He wrote things like, "If it was ever possible, I would give my life and the world to you." He admitted in his own words that his feelings were becoming dangerous, typing, "I am so infatuated with you that it is now becoming unhealthy." He was telling her, point blank, that he was losing control. Celeste was disturbed. She replied politely at first, because that was her nature, but she was firm. She told him she was not interested. She asked him to stop. When he kept messaging, she became more direct. She told him to leave her alone. Then, she blocked his account. But in the digital age, blocking someone is not a wall, it is a hurdle. Sako simply created a new account and started messaging her again. She blocked that one. He made another. It became a game of digital whack, a mole. The messages kept coming, pinging her phone at all hours of the day and night. The content grew more desperate and more obsessive. Celeste realized this was not just a crush, this was stalking. She did exactly what every safety expert advises victims to do. She went to the police. She brought them the messages. She showed them the proof of his harassment. She explained that this man she barely knew was refusing to leave her alone. The legal system responded. Celeste was granted an interim intervention order, which is the Australian version of a restraining order. It was a court document that legally prohibited Lue Sako from contacting her, approaching her, or going near her home. On paper, she was protected. The law had drawn a line in the sand and told Sako not to cross it. For a brief moment, Celeste and her family thought maybe that would be enough to wake him up and make him stop. It was not enough. Sako ignored the order. He continued to message her. He breached the court order almost immediately. The police charged him with the breach. But the wheels of justice turn slowly, and charging someone does not physically stop them from moving freely in the world. Sako remained out of custody, and his obsession only deepened. He was no longer just sending messages, he was hunting. Unknown to Celeste, Sako had turned into a digital detective. He was scouring her social media, looking for clues about where she lived. He cross-referenced her photos with Google Maps, studying street views and landmarks until he pinpointed the exact location of the Mano family home. But he did not stop at the address. He went online and managed to find a floor plan of the house. He downloaded it, he studied it, he learned which room was likely hers. He was not just fantasizing anymore, he was planning a tactical invasion. While Sako was plotting in the shadows, Celeste was trying to live her life. She refused to let fear dictate her every move. She kept working, she kept seeing her friends, and she started dating someone new. She met a guy who made her happy, someone who was actually good for her. It was a bright spot in a year that had been clouded by Sako's harassment. As her birthday approached in November, she felt good. She felt loved. On the evening of November 15th, 2020, Celeste posted a photo on her Instagram. It was a picture of her and her new boyfriend, smiling together. It was a declaration of happiness. It was the kind of photo millions of young people share every day. But for Lue Sako, sitting alone with his obsession, seeing Celeste happy with another man was the final insult. It shattered his fantasy. If he could not have her, he decided, then she would not be allowed to exist. That night, the Mano house was quiet. Celeste went to bed in her room at the front of the house. Her mother, Aggie, did the usual routine, tucked her in, kissed her goodnight, and went to her own room to sleep. The house was dark. The street outside was silent. It was a peaceful suburban night. But miles away, Louis Sacco was getting into his car. He had seen the photo, and he had made his choice. He put a hammer and a kitchen knife into the vehicle and started driving. It was 3:38 in the morning on November 16th. The world was asleep. Sacco pulled up near the Mano home. He knew exactly where he was going because he had memorized the maps. He walked up to the house, moving through the darkness toward the front window, Celeste's window. He knew it was her room because he had studied the floor plans. He stood outside the glass for a moment, holding the hammer. With a violent swing, he smashed the hammer through the window. The sound of shattering glass tore through the silence of the night. Inside the room, Celeste jolted awake. She must have been terrified, confused, trying to understand what was happening. Before she could even get out of bed, Sacco was climbing through the broken window. He was inside. He dropped the hammer and gripped the knife. The attack lasted just 2.5 minutes. It was a frenzy of rage. Sacco stabbed Celeste 23 times. He attacked her while she was trapped in her bed, giving her no chance to run or defend herself. It was brutal and efficient. One of the blows pierced her heart. The violence was so extreme and so fast that by the time her family could react to the noise, it was already over. Sacco dropped the blood-covered knife on the floor of the bedroom. He turned around, climbed back out through the broken window, and ran into the night. Mano heard the noise. She rushed to her daughter's room. She pushed open the door and saw the shattered glass and the blood. She found her daughter, the girl she had just tucked in a few hours ago, lying lifeless. The screaming started then, a sound of pure, raw grief that woke the neighbors and signaled the end of the Mano family's life as they knew it. The police and paramedics arrived, but there was nothing they could do. Celeste was gone. Louis Sacco did not run away to hide. He did not try to cover his tracks. He drove directly to a police station. He walked into the lobby, likely covered in the evidence of his crime, and approached the officers at the desk. He did not confess in a way that showed regret. Instead, he projected his anger onto them. He told the officers, "You know what happened? It is your fault. She is dead. Go have a look." He was blaming the police for not stopping him, as if he were a force of nature that they had failed to contain. He even asked the officers to shoot him right there in the station. They refused. They arrested him, took him into custody, and began the process of charging him with murder. When detectives tried to interview him about the specifics of the attack, Sacco played games. He claimed his memory of the actual killing was fuzzy. He tried to distance himself from the horror of the act, hiding behind a convenient amnesia while the forensic evidence screamed the truth. The investigation was straightforward because Sacco had practically drawn a map of his guilt. They found the floor plans he had downloaded. They found the messages. They found the hammer and the knife. They matched his timeline to the Instagram post. It was clearly premeditated. He had seen the photo of the boyfriend, gathered his weapons, driven to her house, and executed her. It was a cold-blooded punishment for her happiness. For 3 years, the Mano family waited for justice. They had to live with the void in their home while the legal system processed the man who created it. Sacco eventually pleaded guilty, which spared the family from a full trial, but it did not spare them from seeing him in court. During the hearings, Sacco sat in the dock wearing a prison jumper and black-rimmed glasses, showing zero emotion. He looked bored. He fidgeted. He tapped his hands and thumped the side of his head. When Mano, overcome with grief and rage, screamed at him from the gallery, he did not look down in shame. He just continued his odd, detached behavior. He even tried to argue with the prosecutor about how fast he had moved at the crime scene, insisting he had walked briskly rather than run, as if that minor detail mattered at all. He showed no remorse. He offered no apology. He maintained his stance that he was the victim of his own feelings and the system's failure. The sentencing hearing took place in February 2024. The courtroom was packed. Everyone expected the maximum penalty. In the state of Victoria, the harshest punishment is life imprisonment. Given the predatory nature of the stalking, the invasion of her home, and the brutality of the murder, Celeste's family believed Sacco deserved to never walk free again. They wanted to know he would die in prison. Justice Jane Dixon sat on the bench and delivered her ruling. She acknowledged the horror of the crime. She said, "Celeste deserved life, but you decided otherwise." She confirmed that the attack was executed with chilling efficiency. But then, she pivoted. She brought up the psychiatric reports. Experts had testified that Sacco suffered from a severe personality disorder and depression that impaired his judgment. Because of this mental impairment, the judge decided that his moral culpability was reduced. The judge sentenced Louis Sacco to 36 years in prison, with a non-parole period of 30 years. He would be eligible for release in the year 2050. He would be in his 60s, but he would still be alive, and he would potentially be free. He was not given a life sentence. The courtroom erupted, but not with relief. It was a collective gasp of betrayal. The family could not believe what they were hearing. Aggie Mano walked out of the court, shaking with rage. She had prepared a speech for a life sentence, but she tore it up. Instead, she stood before the cameras and unleashed her fury at the system. "It is outrageous," she said. "It is unbelievable that the court decided to show him mercy, even when he showed Celeste none." She pointed out the bitter irony that the legal system seemed more concerned with the rights of the killer than the life of the victim. "I don't believe in parole," she declared. "I don't believe in releasing murderers to murder again." Her words resonated with everyone who had followed the case. Celeste had done everything right. She had used the tools the law gave her. But the intervention order was just paper. The police charges were just words. None of it had put a physical barrier between her and Sacco. And now, the final judgment felt like one last failure to protect her memory. Louis Sacco is currently sitting in a prison cell in Victoria. He has decades to wait before he can ask for freedom, but the date is on the calendar. For the Mano family, there is no calendar. There is no date when Celeste comes back. Her room remains a place where a mother once tucked her daughter in, now shattered by the memory of broken glass and a night that ended too soon. Celeste Mano was 23. She was kind to a stranger, and it cost her everything. Her story is a terrifying reminder that sometimes following the rules is not enough, and that the most dangerous monsters are the ones who tell you exactly who they are, while the world watches and waits until it is too late. We leave the shattered window of a bedroom in suburban Australia and fly across the Pacific Ocean. We cross the vast American landscape, drifting over the flat plains of the Midwest, until we descend upon the green, rolling hills of Wisconsin. The Wisconsin River winds through this valley like a dark snake, cutting through the trees and the limestone bluffs. It flows past the small village of Spring Green, a place known for its quiet beauty and artistic history. It is a place where summer days are usually spent fishing or walking along the water's edge. On the morning of July 30th, 1999, the peace of the river was broken. Children playing near the shore spotted something strange in the weeds. It was a collection of heavy black garbage bags. They had been tossed carelessly along the bank, snagged on the vegetation just out of the current. The children, or perhaps someone walking nearby, looked closer. One of the bags had torn open. Inside, there was something pale and fleshy. It was not trash, it was human remains. Police arrived and cordoned off the riverbank. They pulled the bags from the water and opened them. What they found inside was a puzzle of pure horror. The body had been dismembered with brutal efficiency. The limbs were separated from the torso. But the most chilling discovery was the head. The killer had not just cut the body apart, he had tried to erase the victim's existence. The face had been meticulously skinned. The features were gone, removed with a sharp blade to ensure that no one could ever recognize who this woman was. The woman in the bags was Mwano Mombashi Kapaza. She was 25 years old. Mwano was from a small village in Tanzania, East Africa. She had grown up in a tight-knit community where family was everything. In her culture, cousins were not just distant relatives. They were considered siblings. You protected them, you loved them, and you treated them with the same respect you would give a brother or sister. This bond was sacred. It was the foundation of her life. In 1993, Mwano's cousin, Peter Kapaza, had moved to the United States. He settled in Madison, Wisconsin, and married an American woman. Mwano had dreams of her own. She wanted an education, and she wanted opportunities that were not available in her village. So, she reached out to Peter. He was her brother by custom, and he offered to help her. He sponsored her visa and promised to give her a place to live. In January 1997, Mwano arrived in Wisconsin, full of hope and trusting Peter completely. But the man who welcomed her was not a protector. Peter Kapaza was a predator. Almost immediately after she moved into his apartment, the dynamic shifted. Peter began to make advances toward her. He pressured her into a physical relationship. For Mwano, this was not just abuse, it was a profound violation of her cultural beliefs. In Tanzania, sleeping with your cousin was considered incest. It was a deep stain on the soul, kind of taboo. Mwano was trapped between her dependence on him and her shame. By the summer of 1997, Peter's life was spiraling. His marriage fell apart, partly due to the financial strain of supporting Mwano and the toxic atmosphere in the home. He separated from his wife and moved into a new apartment, taking Mwano with him. The abuse continued. Mwano became pregnant. The shame of carrying a child fathered by her cousin was too much for her to bear. She had an abortion, a decision that further isolated her. She felt she could never go back to Tanzania. The disgrace would follow her. Mwano was stuck in Wisconsin. She had no money, her visa status was shaky, and she had very few friends outside of Peter's circle. She was entirely reliant on the man who was abusing her. Meanwhile, Peter was drowning. He bounced between part-time jobs that paid very little. He stopped making payments on his car. He was evicted from multiple apartments. He was deep in debt, and he began to see Mwano not as a victim, but as a financial burden he needed to unload. In April of 1999, Peter moved into a new apartment on Pleasant View Road in Madison. He told everyone that Mwano was gone. He spun a story that she had returned to Tanzania. He said he had given her money for a plane ticket and had seen her off at the bus station. He told his friends she was back home, safe with her family. For months, everyone believed him. There was no reason not to. People drift apart, immigrants return home, life moves on. But Mwano had not gone anywhere. She was still in Madison, living in the shadows of Peter's life. In June of 1999, more than a month after Peter claimed she had left the country, a letter arrived at his apartment addressed to him from a job placement office. Years later, forensic experts would find a single fingerprint on that envelope. It belonged to Mwano. She was there, handling his mail, alive and trapped, long after she was supposed to be on another continent. In July, Peter began to write strange notes in his personal planner. He wrote in a mix of English and languages spoken in Tanzania. On July 26th, he wrote the word Bodo, which his uncle later translated as falling down into something. In another spot, he wrote Mushinwa, meaning a chosen day. And on July 30th, the day the body bags would be found, he wrote a single chilling phrase, Fazi. It translated to do the job. Peter was planning something dark, and he was marking the date. Sometime in late July, inside that apartment on Pleasant View Road, Peter Kapaza killed Mwano. We do not know exactly how he did it because he destroyed the evidence so thoroughly, but we know what happened next. He dragged her body into the bathroom. He needed to get rid of her, but a whole body is hard to move. So, he decided to take her apart. He used his knowledge of butchery, skills he had learned growing up in Tanzania, to dismember her in the bathtub. It was a bloody, gruesome task. Blood splattered against the bathroom walls. It ran down the tiles and seeped into the crack between the wall and the baseboard. Peter was meticulous about cleaning up. He scrubbed the tub, the walls, and the floor. He used chemicals to wipe away the biological traces, but he missed that one spot behind the baseboard, where a quarter-inch stain of Mwano's blood dried and waited for the police. Then, Peter did the unthinkable. He took a sharp knife and removed the skin from Mwano's face. He peeled away her identity, leaving behind only raw muscle and bone. He wanted to make sure that if she was found, she would just be meat, not a person. He also cut off her fingertips to remove her prints. He packed her remains into plastic shopping bags from a local grocery store called Woodman's. He put some of the bags inside a black canvas duffel bag that belonged to him. Under the cover of night, Peter drove out to the Wisconsin River. He parked his car and hauled the heavy bags to the water's edge. He threw them into the river, hoping the current would carry them away and sink them forever. He returned to his apartment, cleaned his tools, and went back to his life. He continued to tell people that Mwano was in Tanzania. He thought he had erased her completely. When the bags were found on July 30th, the police had no idea who the victim was. The mutilation was so severe that standard identification was impossible. She was a Jane Doe, but the investigators refused to give up. They brought in a forensic artist who studied the skull and the remaining tissues. The artist created a sketch, an approximation of what the woman might have looked like. They printed thousands of posters and plastered them all over Madison. 6 months went by. The case was cold. Then, in January of the year 2000, Peter's ex-wife, Sherry, was walking through a store when she saw one of the posters. She stopped cold. The face on the poster looked familiar. It looked like Mwano. Sherry knew Peter claimed Mwano was in Tanzania, but the resemblance was haunting. She called the police and gave them a tip. She told them to check on Peter Kapaza's cousin. That tip changed everything. Investigators pulled Mwano's old immigration paperwork. They found a set of fingerprints she had given when she entered the country. They compared them to the remains. Despite Peter's attempt to remove her fingertips, enough ridge detail remained on the hands to make a match. The Jane Doe in the river was Mwano Kapaza. The lie was exposed. She had never gone home. On January 31st, police knocked on Peter's door. They asked him where Mwano was. He stuck to his script. He told them she was in Tanzania. He said she had taken a bus to Iowa to meet a friend named Shadrach before flying out. He claimed he had given her $1,500 for the trip. He even told them he had spoken to her father on the phone and confirmed she arrived safely. It was a detailed, confident lie. But the police already knew the truth. They arrested Peter and searched his apartment. The facade crumbled instantly. They found the blood stain behind the baseboard in the bathroom. They found the Woodman's grocery bags, identical to the ones in the river. They found the black duffel bag, and most damning of all, they found Mwano's personal belongings. Her jewelry, her purse, her Bible, things she never would have left behind if she were moving back to Africa. The police found the envelope with the June postmark and Mwano's fingerprint on it. This proved she was in the apartment months after Peter said she left. They found financial records showing Peter was broke and had no savings, proving he could not have given her $1,500. They found the planner with the notes about doing the job. The evidence was overwhelming. Peter had slaughtered his cousin to save money and get his freedom back. At the trial, Peter tried to defend himself. He invented stories about mysterious men and immigration officers. He called a witness named Shadrach to the stand. The man Mwano was supposed to meet in Iowa. But Shadrach testified that he had never seen Wano in the United States and had no idea why she would come to Iowa. Every lie Peter told was dismantled by the prosecution. The jury saw the grocery bags. They saw the blood evidence. They saw the face of a man who could skin his own family member. Peter Capaza was found guilty of first-degree intentional homicide and hiding a corpse. The judge sentenced him to life in prison. In the end, his attempt to erase Mwano failed. He tried to take her face, but her fingerprint survived. He tried to hide her in the river, but the water gave her back. He tried to silence her, but the evidence screamed the truth. Mwano Capaza came to America for a better life. She trusted the one person she was supposed to be able to rely on, and he destroyed her because she became inconvenient. Today, the Wisconsin River flows quietly past the spot where she was found. The bags are gone, but the memory of the woman who was betrayed by her brother remains. Peter Capaza killed his cousin to save money, viewing her life as an expense he could no longer afford. He betrayed the sacred bond of family for financial convenience. But in our next story, we meet a woman who did not kill to save money. She killed to make it. And she did not just betray her family. She betrayed an entire community that looked up to her as a guardian of the law. She turned her blood relatives into paychecks, and she did it while wearing a police uniform. We leave the riverbanks of Wisconsin and travel halfway across the world to the southern tip of the African continent. We land in the town of Bushbuckridge in the Mpumalanga province of South Africa. It is a dry, sprawling community surrounded by game reserves and dusty roads. In 2012, the people of Bushbuckridge felt a certain level of safety because they had officers like Nomia Rosemary Ndlovu patrolling their streets. Rosemary was a police constable. She was a woman in her mid-30s who projected authority and confidence. When you saw her in her blue uniform, you saw someone who had sworn an oath to serve and protect. But behind the badge, Rosemary was operating a secret business that had nothing to do with law enforcement. Since 2006, she had been quietly taking out funeral and life insurance policies. But she was not insuring herself. She was insuring her family members. She had a list of targets. These were the people she hugged at family gatherings, the people she broke bread with. To Rosemary, they were not human beings with futures and feelings. They were investments. The first person on her list was her cousin, witness Madala Homu. In the insurance paperwork, Rosemary brazenly listed him as her husband. It was a lie, but it was a necessary one to ensure she would be the sole beneficiary when he died. In March of 2012, Witness was found dead. His body had been battered, showing signs of severe head injuries. To the local police, who were Rosemary's colleagues, it looked like a robbery gone wrong or a tragic assault. Rosemary played the part of the grieving widow perfectly. She cried, she mourned, and then she collected the insurance payout. The money hit her bank account, and the plan was officially in motion. She had gotten away with murder. The money from the first killing did not last forever. Rosemary had a gambling habit and a taste for a lifestyle her police salary could not support. So, she moved down her list. Her next target was her own sister, Audrey. In June of 2013, Rosemary put a plan in motion to eliminate her. She had taken out policies on Audrey's life, ensuring a substantial payout. On the morning of June 29th, Rosemary showed up at a neighbor's house. Her name was Johanna Mufamadi. Rosemary was already crying. She begged Johanna to come with her to Audrey's house, claiming she was worried about her sister. Johanna hesitated, sensing something was off, but Rosemary's tears were convincing. They walked together toward the small cottage where Audrey lived. As they approached the house, Rosemary pulled out her phone and made a call. She spoke in hushed tones in her native language. Johanna warned her not to make the call, feeling a strange sense of dread, but Rosemary ignored her. When they reached the gate, Rosemary threw herself on the ground and began to wail loudly. It was a performance. She was screaming before they had even confirmed anyone was dead. Her cries attracted other neighbors, creating an audience for her grief. The neighbors entered Audrey's cottage. The security gate was locked, but the wooden door was open. Inside, they found Audrey's body. She had been poisoned and strangled. Beside her body, there were cups that looked out of place, suggesting someone had been there drinking with her before she died. Rosemary tried to rush in and clean up the cups, but the neighbors stopped her. They told her not to touch the crime scene. It was a close call, but Rosemary's status as a police officer likely kept people from asking too many hard questions. Audrey's death brought another payout. Rosemary's bank account swelled again, but the hunger for cash was insatiable. That same month, another cousin named Zanelli Matha was beaten to death. Her body was found with brutal injuries. Rosemary collected again. The pattern was establishing itself. Family members died violently. Rosemary was always nearby, and the insurance companies always paid. Rosemary's cruelty knew no bounds. She eventually targeted her own boyfriend, Maurice Mabasa. Maurice was the father of her child. They had a volatile relationship, often fighting so loudly that landlords threatened to evict them. But they were partners. They had a child together. None of that mattered to Rosemary. In October of 2015, Maurice disappeared. His body was found with more than 70 stab wounds. It was overkill. It was personal. When Maurice was found, Rosemary was the first one to arrive at the morgue to identify him. A nurse noticed something strange about her behavior. Rosemary would burst into loud, theatrical sobs 1 minute, and then stop instantly and look completely composed the next. It was like she was turning a faucet on and off. She denied being the one who called to report his death, even though records showed she had. But still, no one arrested her. She was a cop. She was above suspicion. By 2018, Rosemary had killed at least 5 of her relatives. She had collected approximately 1.4 million rand, which is roughly $93,000. It was a fortune in her community. But she was running out of money again. In January 2018, her nephew, Brilliant Mashego, vanished. He was last seen with Rosemary. His body was found days later. Phone records placed them together, but Rosemary claimed he had just wandered off. Rosemary decided she needed a bigger score. She set her sights on her sister, Gladys, and Gladys's 5 children. This was not going to be a simple poisoning or a beating. Rosemary wanted to wipe out the entire branch of the family in one night. She hatched a plan to burn them all alive in their home. A house fire would look like a tragic accident, and it would trigger multiple policies at once. She needed help to pull this off. She contacted a man named Njabulo Kunene. She thought he was a criminal who would do anything for money. She offered him a job. Go to her sister's house, lock the doors from the outside so no one could escape, and set it on fire. She wanted her sister and 5 nieces and nephews to burn to death in their sleep. But Rosemary had miscalculated. Njabulo was not a monster. He listened to her plan with horror. The idea of killing 5 children was too much. Instead of taking the money, he went to the police. He walked into a station and told them that one of their own officers was plotting a massacre. The police were stunned. They knew Rosemary. They worked with her, but the details were too specific to ignore. Sergeant Keshi Mabunda was assigned to the case. He was a dedicated detective, known for his relentless pursuit of the truth. He was also battling a terminal illness at the time, but he refused to step down. He set up a sting operation. He told Njabulo to play along with Rosemary. They were going to catch her in the act. They wired Njabulo up and told him to agree to the job. On March 7, 2018, the trap was set. Rosemary checked herself into a hospital, creating a fake alibi for the time of the murders. She thought she was being clever. While she was sick in the hospital, her sister's house would burn down. Jabulo picked her up from the hospital, telling her they needed to drive to the house to confirm the location before the attack. Rosemary agreed. She got into the car. What Rosemary did not know was that the man sitting in the back seat was an undercover police officer posing as Njabulo's partner, and hidden inside the car were cameras and microphones recording every second. As they drove the 5 hours from Johannesburg to Bushbuckridge, Rosemary felt comfortable. She started talking. She laid out the entire plan on tape. She explained exactly how she wanted the fire set. She talked about the insurance money. She was calm, cold, and calculated. When they arrived in Bushbuckridge, she pointed out the house. She showed them the windows. She gave them instructions on how to trap the family inside. She was signing the death warrant for her sister and 5 children, all while being recorded in high definition. She thought she was about to become rich. Instead, she was driving straight into a jail cell. The car pulled into a taxi rank where a team of police officers was waiting. Sergeant Mabunda and his team surrounded the vehicle. They opened the door and told Rosemary she was under arrest. For the first time, the mask slipped. The confident police officer realized she had been played. They drove her back to her house and searched it. Inside, they found a trove of evidence. There were stacks of insurance policies, ID documents of her deceased relatives, and notes planning future crimes. Even from prison, Rosemary did not stop. While awaiting trial, she was caught trying to hire hitmen from inside her cell to kill the investigating officer, Sergeant Mabunda, and her former station commander. She wanted to wipe out the people who had caught her. She was charged with conspiracy to commit murder again. The woman was unstoppable in her malice. The trial began in July 2021. It was a spectacle. Rosemary treated the courtroom like a stage. She arrived each day looking well-groomed and arrogant. She posed for the press cameras, flashing peace signs and smiling. When witnesses testified against her, she threw balls of crumpled paper at them. She lifted her skirt to show her thighs to the photographers. It was bizarre, disrespectful, and chilling. She showed absolutely no remorse. The prosecution laid out the case. They had the cell phone records placing her at the murder scenes. They had the insurance documents with her handwriting. They had the testimony of the hitmen she had hired. And they had the video of her in the car, planning to burn her sister's children alive. The evidence was overwhelming. Rosemary claimed it was all a conspiracy against her, but no one bought it. Perhaps the most tragic moment of the trial came when Rosemary's mother took the stand. She testified in defense of her daughter. She told the court she could not believe Rosemary would do such things. She cried for her child. What the mother did not know was that Rosemary had taken out a policy on her life, too. She had planned to kill her own mother after she was done with the sister. The woman defending her was just another paycheck waiting to be cashed. On October 22, 2021, the judge delivered the verdict. Nomia Rosemary Ndlovu was found guilty of 6 counts of murder, 4 counts of fraud, and multiple counts of incitement to commit murder. The judge called her a serial killer. He said she had no conscience. Rosemary stood in the dock, finally silent as the weight of her crimes crashed down on her. She was sentenced to 6 concurrent life terms for the murders. On top of that, she was given dozens of years for fraud and incitement. She will never leave prison. The police officer who had sworn to protect her community had become its greatest predator. She had looked into the eyes of her family members and seen only dollar signs. Rosemary Ndlovu is now behind bars in a high-security prison. Her uniform is gone, replaced by prison orange, but the legacy of her betrayal remains. She showed the world that evil does not always look like a monster. Sometimes, it looks like a sister, a cousin, a mother, or a police officer, smiling at you while they wait for the check to clear. Rosemary Ndlovu destroyed her family for money, wearing a mask of authority to hide her true nature. But in our next story, we meet a killer who did not wear a metaphorical mask. He tried to carve a new face out of his own flesh to hide from the world. He ran from the police not by hiding in the shadows, but by trying to surgically erase the man he used to be, using nothing but a pair of scissors and a needle and thread. We leave the dusty, sun-baked streets of South Africa and fly east, crossing the Indian Ocean and the vast expanse of Asia. We descend into the neon-lit labyrinth of Tokyo, Japan. It is a city of 37 million people, a place where ancient temples stand in the shadow of futuristic skyscrapers. It is a city where millions of commuters move with choreographed precision through massive train stations, and where a young woman from England thought she had found the adventure of a lifetime. Lindsay Hawker was 22 years old. She grew up in the village of Brandon, near Coventry, in the English West Midlands. Lindsay was the kind of person who seemed to vibrate with energy. She was a natural leader, the eldest of 3 sisters, and she had a curiosity about the world that could not be contained by her small hometown. After finishing her university studies in biology, she decided she wanted to see the world. She set her sights on Japan. In October of 2006, Lindsay packed her bags and moved to Tokyo to teach English. She worked for a company called Nova, which was a massive private language school at the time. She settled into the rhythm of life in the capital. She shared an apartment with 2 other roommates, learned to navigate the subway system, and embraced the culture. She was happy. She called her parents, Bill and Julia, constantly to tell them about her new life. On Saturday, March 24, 2007, Lindsay was at a train station when she was approached by a stranger. His name was Tatsuya Ichihashi. He was 28 years old. He was a tall, lanky young man with shaggy hair. He told Lindsay he wanted to learn English. It was a common request in Tokyo, and private lessons were a normal way for teachers to make extra money. Lindsay agreed to give him a lesson. They met at a cafe, and everything seemed normal. The next morning, Sunday, March 25th, they met again. They sat in a coffee shop for about an hour. When the lesson was over, Ichihashi told Lindsay he had forgotten his wallet at his apartment. He asked if she would come back with him to get the money for the lesson. It is a classic ruse, one that sets off alarm bells in hindsight, but in the moment it can feel like a simple logistical problem. Lindsay agreed, but she was cautious. They took a taxi to his building in Ichikawa, a quiet residential area just east of Tokyo. When the taxi pulled up, Lindsay made a decision that showed she was alert to the potential danger. She told the taxi driver to wait. She said she would be right back. She just needed to run in, get the cash, and leave. She walked into the apartment building with Ichihashi, confident that her ride was waiting just outside. The taxi driver sat there, idling the engine. He checked his watch. 1 minute passed. Then 2. He watched the entrance of the building, expecting the young British woman to come running back out. 5 minutes passed. 7 minutes passed. The driver, likely thinking he was being stiffed on a fare or simply tired of waiting, put the car in gear and drove away. He left Lindsay behind. Inside the apartment, the trap had snapped shut. The moment they entered his unit, Ichihashi attacked her. This was not a robbery. It was a violent, predatory assault. He beat her, overpowering her quickly. Lindsay fought back. Her body would later show severe bruising and defensive wounds. She screamed for help, hoping the thin walls of the Japanese apartment complex would allow someone to hear her. But nobody came. Ichihashi realized that her screams were a problem. He made a cold, split-second calculation. He wrapped his hands around her throat and began to squeeze. He choked the life out of her. The struggle ended on the floor of his apartment. Lindsay Hawker, who had a taxi waiting for her just a few hundred feet away, died alone in a stranger's room. Ichihashi was now standing over a body, and he had to figure out what to do with it. Over the next few hours, Ichihashi engaged in a gruesome cover-up. He went into his bathroom and disconnected the bathtub. In Japanese apartments, these are often deep, freestanding units. He He dragged the heavy tub out of the bathroom, through the living space, and onto the balcony. The neighbors later reported hearing strange scraping sounds, the sound of metal dragging across the floor in the middle of the night. Ichihashi placed Lindsay's body inside the tub. He bound her hands and wrapped her in gardening tape. Then, he went to his supply of horticultural materials. He was a gardening enthusiast, and began to bury her. He poured bags of potting soil and sand over her body, filling the tub until she was completely covered, except for one hand. In his haste, he left one of her hands protruding from the dirt, a macabre detail that would signal his crime to the world. By Monday morning, Lindsay was missing. She did not show up for work. Her roommates called her phone, but it went to voicemail. Her parents in England sensed something was wrong immediately. Lindsay never missed a call. The police were contacted. Because Lindsay had left a note about her student or told friends who she was meeting, the police were able to identify Tatsuya Ichihashi relatively quickly. On Tuesday, March 27th, 2 officers knocked on Ichihashi's door. They did not have a warrant yet. They just wanted to ask questions. Ichihashi opened the door. He looked nervous. When the officers asked him about the British woman, he panicked. He shoved past them, barefoot, and sprinted down the hallway. He burst out of the building and ran into the labyrinth of streets. He was fast. He disappeared into the city before they could catch him. The police entered the apartment. They went to the balcony. They found the bathtub filled with sand. They saw the hands sticking out. The manhunt for Tatsuya Ichihashi began immediately. His face was plastered on wanted posters in every train station, convenience store, and police box in Japan. Millions of people were looking for him. But Ichihashi had vanished. For the next 2.5 years, Ichihashi lived as a ghost. He worked day labor jobs under false names. He lived on a remote island for a while, surviving in harsh conditions to stay off the grid. But his biggest problem was his face. It was everywhere. He became obsessed with changing it. He did not have access to a hospital, so he decided to become his own surgeon. In a public restroom or a cheap apartment, Ichihashi took a pair of scissors and a needle and thread. He looked in the mirror and began to cut. He wanted to make his nose narrower. He sliced into his own cartilage. He used the needle to stitch the tissue together, trying to reshape his profile through sheer force and pain. He did this without anesthesia. He was carving himself into a new person. He did not stop at his nose. He had distinctive moles on his face that were highlighted on the wanted posters. So, he took a box cutter, or a pair of scissors, and sliced them off his skin. He dug them out of his cheek, leaving raw wounds. He even tried to cut his lower lip to make it thinner, snipping away the flesh to alter his mouth. It was a butchery of his own body, driven by a desperate fear of capture. Eventually, the self-surgery was not enough. He saved up money from his labor jobs and went to back-alley clinics for professional cosmetic surgery. He got a nose job. He altered his eyelids. He managed to change his appearance significantly. He thought he was safe. He thought he had erased Tatsuya Ichihashi and created a stranger that no one would recognize. But in November of 2009, his vanity tripped him up. He went to a clinic in Nagoya for another procedure. The staff noticed something odd. The man had strange scars on his face, the remnants of his self-inflicted surgeries. He also seemed nervous. One of the staff members had a feeling. They looked at the wanted posters again. Despite the changes, there was something about his eyes, something about his bone structure. They called the police. The police tracked him to a ferry terminal in Osaka. On November 10, 2009, officers approached a man waiting for a boat. He was wearing a hat and sunglasses. When they asked him his name, he hesitated. They took him into custody. It was Tatsuya Ichihashi. After 961 days on the run, the man with the altered face was finally caught. The arrest brought relief to the Hawker family, but the pain was far from over. Ichihashi wrote a book while he was in jail awaiting trial. He titled it Until the Arrest. In the book, he detailed his life on the run. He wrote about the surgeries, the fear, and the places he hid. He tried to humanize himself, to paint himself as a tragic figure. The book was published and became a bestseller in Japan. Lindsay's parents were disgusted. Their daughter's killer was profiting from her death and his own cowardice. The trial began in July 2011. Bill and Julia Hawker flew to Tokyo. They sat in the courtroom and faced the man who had killed their daughter. They had to listen to the gruesome details of the murder. Ichihashi admitted to killing her, but he claimed it was accidental. He said he only meant to silence her screams, not end her life. It was a weak, self-serving defense. The prosecution destroyed his story. They pointed to the bathtub. They pointed to the sand. They pointed to the 2 years he spent running and cutting up his own face. Those were not the actions of a man who had made a mistake. Those were the actions of a man who knew exactly what he had done and would do anything to avoid the consequences. On July 21st, the judge delivered the verdict. Tatsuya Ichihashi was found guilty of rape and murder. The Hawker family had asked for the death penalty, which is legal in Japan. However, the judge sentenced him to life in prison. He cited Ichihashi's lack of a prior criminal record and his young age as reasons for sparing his life. When the sentence was read, Ichihashi fell to his knees and bowed to the Hawker family. It was a dramatic gesture of apology, but it changed nothing. Bill Hawker stood outside the courthouse and spoke to the cameras. He said, "We have waited 4.5 years to get justice for Lindsay. We have achieved that today." He thanked the Japanese public for their support. He refused to let the killer's book or his antics overshadow the memory of his daughter. Lindsay had gone to Japan with an open heart, and she had been met with darkness. Tatsuya Ichihashi is now sitting in a prison cell in Nagano. He will likely die there. The face he spent years trying to change is now hidden away from the world forever. He tried to become someone else to escape his crime, but in the end, he could not cut away the truth. He is exactly who the police said he was. A monster who took a bright young life and tried to bury it in a bathtub. Lindsay Hawker's story is a reminder of the vulnerability of being far from home. She did everything right. She kept in touch with her family. She told people where she was going. She even asked a taxi to wait. But sometimes, evil is just waiting behind a door, and no amount of precaution can stop it. We leave the crowded metropolis of Tokyo and the hidden face of a fugitive. We fly east across the Pacific Ocean, crossing the international dateline and the entirety of the North American continent. We drift over the Appalachian Mountains and descend into the humid, pine-scented air of South Carolina. We land in the small town of Pendleton, nestled in the western corner of the state. It is a historic community, a place of old brick buildings and slow southern rhythms, where families tend to stay put for generations. On Halloween night in 2015, the air in Pendleton was crisp and cool. Children were running through the neighborhoods in costumes, collecting candy and shouting on the sidewalks. It was a night of playful fear, of plastic skeletons and fake spider webs. But on a quiet piece of property just outside the main town, a very real horror was taking place inside a double-wide trailer. It was a massacre that would leave 4 people dead and a community terrified for nearly a decade. The Scott family lived on this property. The head of the household was 58-year-old Mike Scott. He was a hard-working man employed by the Department of Transportation, but he was also a bit of a local character. Mike did not trust banks. He believed in holding his wealth in his hands. He ran a side business, buying and selling gold, silver, and coins. He was good at it, and he accumulated a significant amount of cash over the years. Mike kept his money at home. He had a safe in his bedroom where he stored stacks of bills. He was meticulous about it. He would wrap the cash in bundles, separated by denomination and year. It was his life savings, sitting right there in the house. His wife, 60-year-old Kathy Scott, was a homemaker who took care of the family. They were not living alone. They had opened their home to their aging mothers. Living with them were 82-year-old Violet Taylor, who was Kathy's mother, and 80-year-old Barbara Scott, who was Mike's mother. It was a multi-generational home filled with the specific kind of care that elderly parents require. The four of them lived a quiet life in the large double-wide trailer. But they were not the only ones on the property. Just 50 yards away, in a smaller single-wide trailer, lived Kathy's daughter, Amy Velarde. Amy was 32 years old. She had a complicated history, having been married and divorced multiple times. She was currently living with her new husband, a 28-year-old man named Ross Velarde. Ross was a former United States Marine. He had a military background that included training in close-quarters combat and the use of edged weapons. He was trained to guard embassies, a job that required discipline and lethal skill. The relationship between the two households, the parents in the big trailer and the daughter in the small trailer, was toxic. Amy had 2 children from previous relationships, and they were the center of a bitter feud. In July of 2015, months before the murders, there had been a massive blow-up. Mike and Kathy had taken the grandkids to a church event for the 4th of July. When they brought them back, they allegedly found Amy and Ross drunk. Mike and Kathy tried to take the children away to protect them. This triggered a rage in Amy. She banned her mother and stepfather from seeing their grandchildren. It was a cruel punishment. The grandparents lived 50 yards away, close enough to see the kids playing in the yard, but they were forbidden from speaking to them. For months, the tension on the property was unbearable. But as Halloween approached, Mike Scott tried to fix it. Mike was a peacemaker. He wanted the family to be whole again, especially for the sake of the great-grandmothers, Violet and Barbara, who missed the little ones terribly. He reached out to Amy. They brokered a truce. Amy agreed to let the grandparents see the children again. It seemed like the ice was thawing. On October 29th, 2 days before Halloween, Mike was in good spirits. He even sent a photo to a coworker, showing off a stack of $100 bills he had just organized. That photo would turn out to be one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. It showed the serial numbers on the bills. Mike was just proud of his business, but he was inadvertently documenting the motive for his own murder. Halloween night arrived. The family gathered in the double-wide trailer. There were toys on the coffee table, suggesting the grandchildren had been there, or were expected. Mike and Kathy had just eaten a large dinner. Sometime after dark, the violence began. It was not a robbery by strangers. There was no forced entry. The killer or killers were let inside. Mike Scott was sitting on the couch when he was attacked. He was stabbed 6 times in the neck. The weapon was a large knife, likely a military-style blade. He bled out where he sat. The 2 elderly women, Violet and Barbara, were sitting on a nearby sofa. They tried to get up, tried to run, but they were frail. They were cut down mercilessly. Barbara was stabbed 6 times. Violet was attacked with such ferocity that she was nearly decapitated. Her throat was cut from ear to ear. It was a level of violence that shocked even the most hardened investigators. Kathy Scott, hearing the slaughter in the living room, ran for the bedroom. She left bloody footprints on the floor as she fled. She was trying to get to the gun Mike kept under the bed. She never made it. She was stabbed in the lung before she could grab the weapon. The killers then took Mike's .38 caliber revolver. In a bizarre and gruesome final act, they shot all 4 victims in the head. They were already dead or dying from the knife wounds, but the killers shot them anyway. It was overkill. It was personal. It was a statement. The killers then went to the bedroom. They tipped over a shelf and located Mike's safe. They took the cash, the gold, and the silver. They wiped the scene, leaving behind very little evidence except for a single sneaker print from an Asics running shoe. Then they walked out into the Halloween night, leaving 4 bodies in a trailer filled with holiday candy. The silence on the property returned, heavy and thick. 2 days later, on November 2nd, Amy Velarde made a frantic 911 call. She told the dispatcher she had gone over to check on her parents and found them dead. When the police arrived, Amy was distraught. She played the part of the grieving daughter perfectly. She gave interviews to local news stations, tears streaming down her face. She said, "I don't understand why any of this has happened. I just keep thinking it is a dream I am going to wake up from." She looked into the camera and asked how the killer could live with themselves. The community was heartbroken for her, but the investigators were immediately suspicious. The lack of forced entry pointed to an inside job. They looked at the friction between the 2 trailers. They looked at Amy and Ross. They obtained a search warrant for the Velarde trailer, just 50 yards from the crime scene. Inside Amy and Ross's home, they found a lot of cash. They found $68,000 wrapped in bundles. The money was organized exactly the way Mike Scott organized his money, separated by denomination and year. Amy claimed it was savings from their pet grooming business. But the investigators checked the serial numbers against the photo Mike had sent his coworker. They matched. It was Mike's money. They also found out that Amy and Ross were in deep financial trouble. They had written a bad check for $8,000 that was due to be cashed on November 2nd, the exact day Amy found the bodies. On that morning, before calling the police, Ross had shown up at the bank with $8,000 in cash to cover the debt. The timing was impossible to ignore. They killed the family to pay their bills. Despite the cash and the motive, the case stalled. The evidence was circumstantial. The murder weapon was gone. There was no DNA linking them directly to the act of killing. For 8 years, the case went cold. Amy and Ross remained free. They even sued the estate of the dead family members, fighting to get back the cash the police had seized and claiming ownership of vehicles and property. They fought for every dime. The surviving members of the Scott and Taylor families waited in agony. They watched Amy walk free, knowing she was living on the money she likely stole from their murdered loved ones. It seemed like the perfect crime, but the sheriff's office never stopped working. They kept pulling at the threads, re-examining the sneaker print, re-interviewing witnesses, and building a case that could not be beaten in court. Finally, in December of 2023, more than 8 years after the massacre, the hammer dropped. Sheriff Chad McBride held a press conference. He announced that Amy Velarde and Ross Velarde had been arrested and charged with 4 counts of murder. The town of Pendleton breathed a collective sigh of relief. The monsters had been living among them the whole time. In court, the prosecutors laid out their theory. They believed Amy was the mastermind. She was the one with the rage, the one who hated her mother and stepfather. She was the one who needed the money. Ross was the muscle. His Marine Corps training explained the efficiency of the killing. The filleting of the throats was consistent with military knife combat techniques. He knew how to kill quietly and quickly. They argued that Amy used the Halloween truce to get inside the trailer. She likely distracted the family while Ross did the work. Or perhaps she participated in the violence herself. The fact that they shot the victims after stabbing them suggested a deep, personal hatred. It was not enough to kill them. They wanted to destroy them. And all for a stack of paper bills to pay off a debt. As of late 2025, Amy and Ross Velarde are sitting in jail, awaiting trial. They have been denied bond. They maintain their innocence, but the evidence of the matching serial numbers is a hard thing to explain away. The double-wide trailer where Mike, Kathy, Violet, and Barbara died still stands on the property, a silent monument to a Halloween night that went terribly wrong. The Pendleton murders are a grim reminder of what greed can do to a family. Mike Scott spent his life saving money to protect his loved ones. He kept it in a safe, thinking it was secure. He never imagined that the person who would come for it was the little girl he helped raise. or that his own savings would become the bounty on his head. We stay in South Carolina for our final story, but we leave the cramped trailer park in Pendleton and travel 200 miles southeast. We head into the Low Country, a region defined by saltwater marshes, humid air, and ancient live oak trees draped in heavy Spanish moss. We arrive at a sprawling 1,700-acre hunting estate known as Moselle. For decades, this land was the private kingdom of a family that did not just know the law. They were the law. For nearly a century, the Murdaugh family held an iron grip on the judicial system in this part of the state. Starting in 1920, 3 generations of Murdaugh men served consecutively as the solicitor for the 14th Judicial Circuit. This is the equivalent of a district attorney, but with the power of a political dynasty. For 86 years, if you committed a crime in this 5-county region, or if you were a victim of one, your fate rested in the hands of a Murdaugh. They prosecuted the cases, they knew the judges, and they ran the show. By 2021, the face of this dynasty was Richard Alexander Murdaugh, known to everyone simply as Alex. He was a tall, imposing man with red hair and a booming voice. He was a personal injury attorney at the family's powerful law firm, PMPED. From the outside, Alex had it all. He had a loving wife named Maggie, 2 adult sons named Buster and Paul, and a lifestyle of boats, beach houses, and hunting lodges. He was respected, feared, and wealthy. But the house of Murdaugh was built on a foundation of rot. Alex Murdaugh was living a double life. Beneath the veneer of the successful Southern gentleman, he was a desperate drug addict with a massive opioid habit. To fuel his addiction and maintain his lavish lifestyle, Alex had been stealing money for years. He was not just skimming off the top, he was stealing millions of dollars from his own clients, people who had been injured or disabled and trusted him to fight for them. He stole from widows. He stole from orphans. He stole from the family of his own housekeeper, Gloria Satterfield, who died after falling down the steps at Moselle. He secured a multi-million-dollar settlement for her sons and then pocketed almost every dime of it. He was running a massive Ponzi scheme inside a law firm, robbing Peter to pay Paul, all while smiling and shaking hands at the country club. But in February of 2019, the first crack appeared in the dam. Alex's youngest son, Paul Murdaugh, was 19 years old. He was known for being wild and reckless, especially when he was drinking. One night, Paul took the family boat out with a group of friends. He was heavily intoxicated, with a blood alcohol level 3 times the legal limit. He insisted on driving the boat home in the dark. He slammed the vessel into a bridge piling. The crash was catastrophic. Several teenagers were injured, and a 19-year-old girl named Mallory Beach was thrown into the water. By June of 2021, the pressure was unbearable. The lawsuit was moving forward, and his own law firm was starting to ask questions about missing fees. Alex was cornered. He needed a distraction. He needed the world to stop looking at his bank account and start looking at him with sympathy. On June 7th, he made a phone call to his wife, Maggie. She was staying at their beach house in Edisto, away from the stress of Moselle. Alex asked Maggie to come home to Moselle that night. He claimed his father was dying in the hospital, and he wanted her support. Maggie was hesitant. She texted a friend saying that Alex was acting fishy and that he was up to something. She did not want to go, but she loved him, so she got in her car and drove to the hunting estate. She arrived in the evening and eventually made her way down to the dog kennels, which were located a few hundred yards from the main house. Paul was already at the kennels. He was checking on a friend's dog that was staying there. At 8:44 in the evening, Paul pulled out his cell phone. His friend had asked for a video of the dog's tail because there was a concern about an injury. Paul recorded a short video on Snapchat. It was less than a minute long. In the background of that video, you can hear 3 distinct voices. One belongs to Paul, one belongs to Maggie, and the third voice belongs to Alex. Maggie must have heard the shots. She was standing nearby. The killer turned the second weapon on her. It was an AR-style rifle. She was shot 5 times. One of the shots struck her in the back, suggesting she was trying to run away or had fallen. She died right there on the gravel, just feet away from her son. The estate fell silent. The humid night air was filled with the smell of gunpowder and the sound of barking dogs. Alex Murdaugh left the scene. He drove to his mother's house in a nearby town, creating a digital trail with his car's GPS and his phone. He stayed for a short visit, chatting with his mother's caretaker, acting normal. Then he drove back to Moselle. At 10:06 in the evening, he called 911. He put on the performance of a lifetime. He was screaming, crying, begging for help. "My wife and child were just shot badly," he told the operator. When the police arrived, Alex played the grieving father. He told them he had been napping at the main house when the murders happened. He said he had not been down to the kennels at all that night. He suggested that vigilantes angry about the boat crash must have done this. He pointed the finger at imaginary enemies. For a while, it seemed to work. The police treated him with deference. He was a Murdaugh, after all. But as the weeks went by, the story started to crack. 3 months later, in September, Alex called 911 again. This time, he said he had been shot in the head on the side of a rural road while changing a tire. It looked like someone was hunting the Murdaugh family. But the police quickly realized the story was fake. Alex had hired a hitman to shoot him, so his surviving son, Buster, could collect a $10 million life insurance policy. The bullet had just grazed him. The assassination attempt was a fraud. This bizarre stunt blew the case wide open. The investigators stopped treating Alex like a victim and started treating him like a suspect. They dug into the financials and found the millions of dollars in stolen money. They indicted him for fraud. And then they went back to the murders. They analyzed Paul's cell phone. They found the Snapchat video. They listened to the voices. In July of 2022, Alex Murdaugh was indicted for the murders of Maggie and Paul. The trial began in January 2023 in the small town of Walterboro. It was the trial of the century for South Carolina. The prosecution laid out a case of a man whose world was collapsing, a man who decided to sacrifice his family to save himself from exposure. They argued he killed them to gain sympathy and stop the financial investigation. The courtroom was packed every day. Millions watched on television. The pivotal moment came when the prosecution played the kennel video. Several witnesses, including family friends, identified the third voice as Alex. For 20 months, Alex had sworn he was never at the kennels that night. The video proved he was lying. He was there just minutes before they died. Alex took the stand in his own defense. It was a Hail Mary pass. He admitted, finally, that he had lied. He told the jury, "I did lie to them." He blamed his opioid addiction, saying it made him paranoid. He admitted being at the kennels but insisted he left before the shooting started. He cried. He called Paul his little detective. But he could not explain why he lied for 2 years if he was innocent. The prosecutor, Creighton Waters, grilled him. He forced Alex to admit to stealing from his clients. He painted a picture of a man who could look people in the eye, tell them he loved them, and then rob them blind. He argued that killing his family was just the ultimate act of theft, stealing their lives to buy himself time. The jury did not buy Alex's tears. They saw a manipulator who had run out of tricks. On March 2, 2023, the jury returned a verdict after just 3 hours of deliberation. Guilty. Alex Murdaugh was convicted of murdering his wife and son. The man who had once been untouchable was handcuffed and led away. Judge Clifton Newman sentenced him to 2 consecutive life terms in prison, without the possibility of parole. The dynasty was officially dead. But Alex was not done facing justice. In November of 2023, he pleaded guilty to 22 counts of financial crimes. He was sentenced to another 27 years in state prison. Then, in April of 2024, he was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison for money laundering and fraud. He was ordered to pay millions in restitution. He will never breathe free air again. That is where we end our journey tonight. We have traveled through 12 stories, from the heights of an amusement park tower to the depths of the ocean, and finally to the ruin of a southern dynasty. We have seen accidents, mysteries, and the darkest parts of the human heart. Soft whisper. Listen to the rain. It is still falling outside your window, a steady, gentle rhythm pattering against the glass. The storm has passed, and now it is just the water washing everything clean. Imagine you are in a warm room. The air is safe and still. You are wrapped in a heavy, soft blanket. You can feel the weight of it pressing down on you, relaxing your shoulders, relaxing your arms. Breathe in slowly. Fill your lungs with the cool, clean air. Hold it for a moment, and breathe out. Let the tension leave your body with your breath. The rain continues to fall. Tap, tap, tap. It is a lullaby from nature. There is nothing out there that can hurt you. The doors are locked. The world is far away. Focus on the sound of the water. It is a white noise that smooths out your thoughts. Picture a dark screen. No images, no stories. Just the soothing darkness of sleep. You are sinking deeper into the mattress. Your legs are heavy, your eyes are heavy. It is time to drift, time to float away. The rain will keep watch. The night is quiet, you are safe. Good night.